Stand in the ruins at dawn. Feel the wind move through corridors where no footsteps have echoed for 1,000 years. The stones are cold under your fingers. They remember something we've forgotten. Somewhere in these empty halls, children once laughed. Markets buzzed with the negotiation of prices. Priests chanted prayers to gods whose names we'll never know. And then silence. This is the question that haunts every archaeologist who has ever brushed dust from ancient walls. What force could erase entire civilizations from existence, leaving only whispers in stone? We're not talking about villages swallowed by natural disasters. We're not discussing primitive settlements abandoned for better hunting grounds. The civilizations that vanished were advanced beyond anything their neighbors achieved. They had writing systems that recorded laws, debts, marriages, and histories. They built architectural marvels that required mathematics we still struggle to reverse, engineer. Their populations numbered in the hundreds of thousands, cities as large as any European capital of the medieval period, thriving 1,000 years earlier. Yet they vanished so completely that even their names were forgotten. For centuries the jungle grew over their temples, sand drifted through their palaces, rain eroded their walls. When archaeologists finally began piecing together fragments in the 19th and 20th centuries, they discovered something that should be impossible. These weren't fallen empires slowly declining over generations. Many were at the height of their power when they disappeared. The conventional story of civilization tells us empires fall when they become weak, corrupt, invaded, or plagued. But the evidence from dozens of sites across 5 continents tells a different story. These societies didn't collapse under the weight of obvious catastrophe. There are no mass graves indicating plague, no burn layers suggesting conquest, no skeletal evidence of famine that killed everyone. Instead, archaeologists find something far more unsettling. They find cities abandoned in the middle of daily life. Cooking pots still contain the carbonized remains of meals never eaten. Tools lie in workshops, projects half finished. Doors are sealed from the outside, valuables deliberately buried as if people planned to return but never did. In some locations, the evidence suggests planned departures, careful, methodical abandonments over months or years. In others, entire populations seem to have simply walked away overnight. This is not the story you were taught in school. The textbooks speak of rises and falls, of natural progressions and inevitable declines. They offer neat explanations. Drought ended this one. Invasion destroyed that one. Economic collapse finished another. But when you examine the evidence closely, when you read what the stones actually say rather than what we want them to say, a pattern emerges that is far more disturbing. 7 major civilizations across different continents and different time periods, advanced societies with no contact with each other, all vanished at the height of their power, all left behind questions carved in stone. The Earth itself seems to have decided to erase them from history, and if it happened to them, the question becomes unavoidable. Could it happen to us? Imagine a map of the world, not as it is now, but as it was thousands of years ago. On this map, we'll mark every location where a major civilization simply vanished. Place a marker in the Indus Valley of Pakistan, where cities housing 40,000 people were abandoned within a single generation. Move west to the Mediterranean, where the Minoan civilization controlled hundreds of islands and thousands of square miles of coastline before disappearing so completely that even their language remains undeciphered. Travel southeast to Cambodia, where Angkor, a city larger than modern Los Angeles, was swallowed by jungle after sustaining 1 million inhabitants for centuries. Cross the Pacific to the American Southwest, where the Ancestral Puebloans built apartment complexes into sheer cliff faces, then sealed the doors and walked away. Mark the coast of Peru, the highlands of Mexico, the islands of the Pacific. 7 major civilizations, 5 continents, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. No contact with each other, no shared culture or language or religion. Yet the pattern is impossible to ignore. These weren't small settlements. The Indus Valley civilization at its height controlled an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Angkor's hydraulic engineering network covered nearly 400 square miles. The Minoan trading empire reached from Egypt to Spain. These were regional superpowers, wealthy beyond measure, technologically sophisticated, politically stable, and they were thriving when they vanished. This is what makes the pattern so deeply unsettling. We expect civilizations to collapse when they're weak, when they've been drained by war or famine or disease. That is the narrative we're comfortable with. The idea that decline is visible, predictable, a slow fall from greatness. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Many of these civilizations show no evidence of decline before their end. Their final decades produced their most impressive architecture. Trade networks were expanding, not contracting. Populations were growing, not shrinking. By every measurable metric, they were succeeding. Then they stopped. In the Indus Valley, archaeologists have found doors sealed from the outside with mud bricks, as if residents were securing homes they expected to return to. In ancestral Puebloan sites, valuables were deliberately buried in careful caches beneath floors, not the frantic hiding of people fleeing violence, but methodical storage suggesting planned absence. At Angkor, the temples were maintained even as the surrounding city emptied, as if caretakers stayed behind to honor what everyone else had abandoned. These departures weren't panicked evacuations, they were organized, sometimes taking years. People made choices about what to take and what to leave. They performed rituals of closure. Some sealed their wells, others plastered over doorways. A few left cryptic final messages carved in stone, written in languages we still can't fully translate. But here is what archaeologists don't find: bodies. In most of these locations, there are no mass graves, no skeletal evidence of plague that killed everyone in place, no scorch marks indicating the fires of conquest, no layers of ash suggesting volcanic catastrophe. The population simply ceased to exist in the archaeological record. They were there for centuries, leaving behind pottery and tools and trash and temples. Then they were gone. 40,000 people living in Mohenjo-Daro vanished. 1 million inhabitants of Angkor vanished. Tens of thousands in Minoan palaces across Crete vanished. Not dead, exactly, just absent. As if they walked away from everything their ancestors had built over a dozen generations and disappeared into the landscape. 7 civilizations. One impossible pattern. We have the ruins they left behind. We have the tools to investigate those ruins with precision our grandparents couldn't have imagined. But the single question that matters remains unanswered. Where did they go, and why did they leave? The ruins don't speak in words, but they do speak. Every broken wall, every pottery shard, every bone fragment is a sentence in a language we've only recently learned to read. The clues are there, preserved in ash, buried in soil, written in bone, and what they reveal is more disturbing than any ancient curse. Modern archaeology isn't what you imagine from movies. There are no adventurers with whips and fedoras, no dramatic unveiling of golden treasures. Instead, there are scientists with ground-penetrating radar mapping what lies beneath the surface before a single shovel breaks ground. Satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth use imaging technology to reveal the ghostly outlines of cities buried under jungle canopy or desert sand. Laboratories analyze isotopes in bone collagen to reconstruct the exact diet someone ate 3,000 years ago, down to whether they preferred river fish or ocean fish, whether they ate mostly grain or mostly meat. The excavation process itself is meticulous, almost to the point of tedium. Archaeologists remove dirt layer by layer, sometimes just millimeters at a time. Each layer represents a slice of time, not just years but specific seasons, specific moments. Pollen trapped in these layers tells us what plants were growing when people lived here. If pollen from drought-resistant plants suddenly replaces pollen from water-loving species, we know the climate shifted. If agricultural pollen disappears and wild plant pollen returns, we know farming stopped. Bone chemistry reveals secrets the dead never intended to share. Strontium isotopes absorbed from water and food leave chemical fingerprints that identify where someone grew up, even if they died thousands of miles away. Nitrogen isotopes indicate protein consumption. Carbon isotopes distinguish between different types of crops. By analyzing skeletons from abandoned cities, researchers can track migration patterns, identify whether populations left quickly or slowly, determine if nutrition declined before departure. Pottery styles function like fingerprints for cultures. When archaeologists find pottery from the Indus Valley in Mesopotamian sites, they know these civilizations traded. When pottery styles suddenly change at a site, they know new people arrived, or old residents adopted new customs. When pottery production simply stops mid-style, they know something interrupted the normal flow of culture. And then there are the moments frozen in time. Burned grain preserves better than unburned grain. When archaeologists find carbonized wheat or barley in abandoned granaries, they can identify the exact species, the exact stage of ripeness, which tells them the precise season when fire swept through. A granary filled with spring wheat burned in early summer. A storage room with autumn barley burned in late fall. These details aren't trivial. They tell us whether people had just harvested or were about to harvest, whether they left after securing food or before securing food. Tooth marks on discarded animal bones reveal whether people were desperate or comfortable. When you have plenty to eat, you discard bones with meat still attached. When food is scarce, you gnaw bones clean, crack them for marrow, boil them for broth. The archaeology of desperation looks different from the archaeology of abundance. Construction projects halted mid-build are perhaps the most haunting evidence. Walls left half-finished, stone blocks cut at quarries but never transported, buildings with foundations laid but no walls erected. These frozen moments suggest something interrupted normal life suddenly enough that major projects were simply abandoned. The scientific tools are remarkable. The evidence they've revealed is tangible and specific. We know more about these vanished civilizations than anyone imagined possible 50 years ago. But here is the twist that keeps archaeologists awake at night. The evidence creates more questions than it answers. Some sites show careful, methodical abandonment stretching over years. Doors sealed, valuables buried, rooms cleaned. Other sites suggest people walked away overnight, leaving meals half-eaten and tools scattered. Some civilizations left cryptic final messages carved in stone, inscriptions we can read but can't fully understand. Warnings or prophecies or prayers in languages where we know the grammar, but not the context. Other civilizations left no messages at all, just empty buildings and silent streets. The Indus Valley cities were abandoned gradually, over decades. The Minoan palaces burned in what seems like a single catastrophic season. Angkor emptied slowly while its temples were maintained. The Ancestral Puebloans sealed their cliff dwellings as if preparing for temporary absence, but never returned. We have evidence. We have clues. The science is solid. But the truth remains just beyond reach, like something glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanishes when you turn to look directly. Walk the excavated streets of Mohenjo-Daro in modern-day Pakistan, and you'll see something that shouldn't exist. The streets run in perfect grids, intersecting at right angles with a precision that suggests surveying tools and mathematical planning. The main avenues are wide enough for two carts to pass comfortably. Side streets branch off at measured intervals. This was 2500 BCE, while most humans on Earth lived in scattered villages of mud huts, while Stonehenge was still under construction, while the pyramids of Egypt were barely a century old. The Indus Valley civilization had already mastered urban planning that wouldn't be matched for 2,000 years. Stand at any intersection in Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro and look down. Beneath the ancient streets runs a covered sewage system, not open ditches, not cesspits. Covered brick channels that carried waste away from homes out of the city into designated areas downstream. Every house, not just elite residences but every single dwelling, connected to this system. Private bathrooms on upper floors featured terracotta pipes leading down through walls to the sewers below. Public wells appeared every few blocks, their brick constructions standardized to prevent contamination. The bricks themselves tell a story. Across hundreds of miles, in dozens of cities, the Indus people used bricks in a precise ratio, length to width to height at 4:2:1. Whether you were building in Harappa in the north or Lothal near the coast, the bricks fit the same specifications. This wasn't coincidence. This was standardization across an area of 1.5 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe. 5 million people lived in this civilization at its peak. 5 million people using the same weights and measures for trade, the same brick dimensions for construction, the same urban planning principles for city design. Yet archaeologists have found no palaces, no monumental temples dominating city centers, no royal tombs filled with treasures, no fortifications suggesting warfare, no obvious signs of kings or priests or military commanders. The evidence suggests something remarkable. An egalitarian society that achieved what hierarchical empires could. The largest buildings were granaries capable of feeding tens of thousands, and public baths that anyone could access. Multi-story homes lined the streets, and while some were larger than others, even modest houses had private bathrooms and sewer connections. Children played with wheeled toys. Adults played board games. Artisans created delicate jewelry and carved seals depicting animals in naturalistic detail. This was a civilization with leisure time, with public health infrastructure, with apparent civic equality. They built sewage systems that wouldn't be matched until the Roman Empire 2 millennia later. They standardized measurements and construction across distances that wouldn't see such uniformity again until the Industrial Age. They created cities where sanitation was universal, not a privilege of the wealthy. And then, around 1900 BCE, they began to walk away. The abandonment wasn't sudden. It took decades, perhaps longer. People didn't flee in panic. They left gradually, trickling away year by year, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. The sewage systems fell into disrepair. The streets went unswept. Buildings crumbled without maintenance. The granaries emptied and stayed empty. Where did 5 million people go? Why would they abandon cities that represented the most advanced urban civilization on Earth? The archaeological record offers no mass graves, no evidence of conquest, no signs of catastrophe. Just empty streets where the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world slowly return to dust, leaving behind a question that still haunts us. What could make people walk away from perfection? For over a century, archaeologists have proposed theories to explain the Indus Valley's abandonment. Each theory seems plausible at first, each is supported by evidence, and each ultimately fails to explain what actually happened. The oldest theory is the simplest: invasion. Early 20th century archaeologists believed that Aryan warriors from the north swept down into the Indus Valley around 1900 BCE, destroying the cities and scattering the population. The theory was neat, matching historical patterns where complex civilizations fall to warrior cultures. For decades it was accepted as fact, but the evidence doesn't support it. There are no mass graves, no skeletal remains showing trauma from weapons, no layers of ash indicating cities burned in conquest, no caches of weapons suggesting desperate last stands. The archaeological record shows no violence at all. The cities weren't destroyed, they were abandoned, gradually, peacefully, over decades. People didn't flee invaders, they simply left. The second theory focuses on climate, drought. Geological and climate evidence shows that around 2000 BCE, the region began experiencing prolonged dry periods. The Sarasvati River, which once flowed through the heart of Indus territory, dried up. Monsoon patterns shifted. Water became scarce. Without reliable water sources, the theory goes, the cities became uninhabitable. This explanation feels more scientific, more grounded in environmental reality, and there is genuine evidence supporting it. The Sarasvati did dry up. The climate did change. Droughts did occur. But here is the problem. These were master water engineers. They built covered sewage systems, public wells, and water management infrastructure unmatched in the ancient world. They lived in this region for 1,000 years, weathering droughts before. More troubling for the theory, many Indus cities near reliable water sources were also abandoned. Harappa sat beside the Ravi River, which never dried up. Mohenjo-Daro was near the Indus River, flowing strong to this day. If drought was the cause, why abandon cities with guaranteed water? The third theory suggests economic collapse. Perhaps trade networks failed. Perhaps the economy that sustained urban life broke down, forcing people to return to rural agriculture. The theory has logic. Complex civilizations need economic systems to function. Yet excavations reveal granaries still full of grain when the cities were abandoned. Workshops contain tools laid down mid-use as if craftspeople simply walked away from their work. Storage facilities held goods never distributed. There is no evidence of economic stress severe enough to force millions into migration. The cities weren't starving. They weren't impoverished. They were functioning when people left. But there is evidence of something more subtle, more disturbing, in the final occupation layers, the last decades before abandonment. Archaeologists find signs of declining maintenance. Streets developed potholes that weren't repaired. Buildings show crude patches rather than proper renovations. Public spaces that were once meticulously maintained fell into disrepair. Sewage systems, once the pride of Indus engineering, clogged and were left clogged. This isn't the archaeology of catastrophe. It is the archaeology of apathy. The civilization didn't explode. It didn't burn. It didn't starve. It slowly, gradually lost the will to maintain itself. People stopped investing in public infrastructure. They stopped following the building standards that had been uniform for centuries. They stopped caring whether the streets were clean or the sewers functioned. And here is the most unsettling detail. The Indus script, carved on thousands of seals found throughout the cities, remains undeciphered. We can read Sumerian cuneiform from the same period. We can read Egyptian hieroglyphics. But Indus script keeps its secrets. If these people left messages explaining why they abandoned their cities, we can read them. If they recorded disasters or decisions or debates, the words are locked away in symbols we don't understand. Every theory explains part of what happened. Climate changed, trade may have declined, social structures clearly weakened. But none of these theories explain why 5 million people gradually, peacefully, deliberately walked away from the most advanced civilization on Earth. None explain why they left their sewage systems to fail, their streets to crumble, their cities to die not from invasion or disaster, but from simple neglect. The truth appears to be more unsettling than any single catastrophe. Perhaps the Indus Valley civilization simply dissolved when its people stopped believing in it. When a civilization collapses catastrophically, you find bodies, mass graves from plague, skeletal trauma from warfare, evidence of starvation in bone chemistry. The dead tell you what killed them. But the Indus Valley civilization left almost no bodies. The people didn't die, they vanished. For decades, this vanishing seemed like an unsolvable mystery. Where could 5 million people go? How do you hide an entire population? Then modern genetic analysis provided the first clue. The Indus people are still here. DNA extracted from ancient Indus skeletons shows clear genetic continuity with modern populations across Pakistan and northern India. The genes didn't disappear. They dispersed. The descendants of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro still live in the region, their ancestry traceable through thousands of years. But something else disappeared entirely, their civilization. Archaeological evidence of what happened exists, scattered across hundreds of rural sites. In the centuries after the urban centers emptied, pottery styles characteristic of Indus cities begin appearing in small villages that had never before shown such sophistication. Not crude imitations, but genuine Indus pottery. The same forms, the same firing techniques, the same decorative motifs. The potters who made vessels for Mohenjo-Daro's markets had moved to villages and kept making pottery, but they never rebuilt the cities. Skeletal evidence from these later rural sites tells a story of dramatic lifestyle change. Isotope analysis of bones shows shifts in diet. Urban Indus populations ate primarily wheat and barley, with some river fish, the diet of city dwellers dependent on granary distribution. Post-urban populations show more varied diets, different grains, more wild game, more diverse plant foods. These are the diets of people living closer to the land, more self-sufficient, less dependent on urban infrastructure. Settlement patterns transformed completely. The planned grid cities with their covered sewers and public wells vanished. In their place, scattered farmsteads, small villages, settlements following no apparent plan. People built homes where convenient, not according to standardized measurements. They dug simple wells instead of engineering complex water systems. They used cesspits instead of sewage networks. But the most striking abandonment wasn't physical, it was cultural. The Indus script disappeared. Not gradually, not evolving into something simpler. It simply stopped being used. Thousands of seals carved with Indus symbols have been found in the cities. In the rural sites that followed, there are none. Whatever those symbols meant, whatever records they kept, whatever ideas they preserved, forgotten. The knowledge of writing itself, abandoned, standardized weights and measures uniform across hundreds of miles for centuries were forgotten. Each village developed its own local standards. The sophisticated bronze tools that Indus craftspeople had perfected were replaced by simpler implements. The advanced sewage engineering was never replicated, not even in simplified form. Knowledge that had taken generations to develop vanished within a few generations. This is what archaeologists call de-urbanization. But that clinical term doesn't capture the strangeness of what happened. This wasn't a civilization in decline, slowly losing capabilities over centuries. This was deliberate abandonment. People who knew how to build sewage systems chose to use cesspits. People who knew how to write chose to stop writing. People who knew how to construct planned cities chose to scatter into unplanned villages. It is as if they collectively decided to forget they'd ever been civilized. This phenomenon isn't entirely unique in human history. Other cultures have voluntarily simplified. Some societies in the Amazon deliberately moved away from complex settlements to avoid diseases that thrive in dense populations. Island societies in the Pacific occasionally abandoned large centers for distributed living. But the Indus case is extreme. This was a civilization of 5 million people spread across an area the size of Western Europe, all simultaneously deciding to discard urban life. And here is the detail that makes this choice even more mysterious. They weren't forced to leave. Isotope analysis of bones from the final occupation layers of Indus cities shows people were well fed. Dental health was good. There is no evidence of nutritional stress. The granaries were still full. The wells still held water. People who left Mohenjo-Daro were healthy, not desperate. This wasn't refugees fleeing catastrophe. This was a choice. But what kind of choice? What could convince millions to abandon everything? To forget not just cities, but the very concept of urban civilization. To walk away from sewage systems and writing and standardized measurements and everything their ancestors had spent 1,000 years building. The cities stood empty for centuries after the people left. Gradually, floods from the Indus River buried Mohenjo-Daro under silt. Dust storms covered Harappa. The bricks were scavenged by later peoples who had no idea what they were dismantling. The grid streets disappeared beneath accumulated soil. The sewers clogged and collapsed. The wells filled with debris. By the time Alexander the Great S army passed through the region in 326 BCE, over 1,500 years after the abandonment, there was no memory that cities had ever existed there. The descendants of the Indus people, living in their scattered villages, apparently never told their children stories about the great urban civilization their ancestors had built and abandoned. They didn't die, they didn't flee, they simply chose to forget. And that choice remains more mysterious than any catastrophe could ever be. 1,700 years before Rome, 1,500 years before classical Athens, there was Crete. And on Crete, there was a civilization unlike anything Europe would see again for millennia, the Minoans, named thousands of years later after the legendary King Minos, built sprawling palace complexes that covered acres, rising 3 and 4 stories high. At Knossos, the largest palace, corridors branched and twisted through hundreds of rooms, creating a labyrinth so complex that later Greeks would weave myths around it, stories of monsters hidden in impossible architecture. But the real Knossos needed no myths. The reality was remarkable enough. Walk through the reconstructed sections and you see what Bronze Age Europe achieved. Indoor plumbing with terracotta pipes carrying fresh water to upper floors. Sophisticated drainage systems preventing flood damage. Light wells illuminating interior rooms. Frescoes covering walls in colors still vibrant after 35 centuries. Dolphins leaping through blue waves, women in elaborate dresses watching athletic competitions, bulls frozen mid, leap with acrobats somersaulting over their backs. The art tells you something about these people. Other Bronze Age civilizations carved scenes of conquest, kings trampling enemies, armies marching towards subjugated cities. Minoan art shows nature, celebration, movement, joy. Their frescoes depict women prominently, not as possessions or victims, but as participants in public life, sometimes in positions suggesting authority. Archaeological evidence supports what the art implies. This may have been a civilization with significant female leadership, unusual for its time. Their ships dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, Cyprus, coastal Anatolia, mainland Greece, even as far west as Spain. They exported olive oil, wine, textiles, and metalwork. They imported tin from distant sources, creating bronze that armed and enriched the Aegean world. The palace at Knossos may have housed 100,000 people at its height, making it one of the largest cities of the ancient world. This was Europe's first complex civilization. While mainland Europe remained scattered villages and tribal territories, Crete had multi-story architecture, international trade networks, artistic sophistication, and urban populations. They flourished for over 1,000 years from roughly 3000 to 1450 BCE, reaching their peak around 1600 BCE when Minoan influence extended across hundreds of islands and coastlines. And then, in a single generation, they were gone. Not gradually, like the Indus Valley, not through slow dissolution over decades. The Minoan collapse was sudden and violent. Archaeological layers show it clearly: thriving palaces one moment, burned ruins the next. Knossos burned. The palace at Phaistos burned. Settlements across Crete show destruction layers from the same period. The distinctly Minoan culture, the nature frescoes, the feminine imagery, the labyrinthine architecture, the sophisticated art, simply stopped appearing in the archaeological record. Here is what makes it strange. Crete itself didn't empty. The island remained inhabited. People still lived there. But they weren't Minoans anymore. The cultural elements that had persisted for over 1,000 years vanished almost overnight, replaced by Mycenaean Greek influence. Different pottery styles, different architectural principles, different burial customs, different writing system, as if the Minoan identity itself had been erased while the population remained. For decades, archaeologists thought they had the answer. A natural disaster so catastrophic it destroyed an entire civilization. The Thera eruption, one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history, just 70 miles from Crete. The theory was elegant. The evidence seemed compelling. But like most elegant theories about vanished civilizations, it explains less than it appears to. The truth, as always, is more disturbing than simple catastrophe. 70 miles north of Crete, the island of Thera exploded. This wasn't a simple eruption. This was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The volcano ejected 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The explosion was heard across the Mediterranean. Tsunamis up to 40 meters high, taller than a 10-story building, radiated outward from the blast site. Ash fell across thousands of square miles, darkening skies from Anatolia to Egypt. The island of Thera itself was obliterated, leaving only a crescent-shaped remnant we now call Santorini. Its center collapsed into a submerged caldera. For decades after its discovery, archaeologists believed this eruption explained everything. How could Minoan civilization survive such catastrophe? Surely the tsunamis destroyed coastal settlements. Surely the ashfall poisoned crops. Surely the psychological trauma of witnessing such devastation shattered their society. The evidence seemed overwhelming. At Akrotiri, a Minoan town on Thera itself, volcanic ash preserved buildings exactly as they stood when residents fled. Like a Bronze Age Pompeii, you can walk streets frozen in time, see frescoes still brilliant on walls, find pottery stacked in storage rooms. The town was prosperous, connected to Cretan culture through art and architecture. Then the volcano buried it under meters of pumice and ash. On Crete, excavations found tsunami deposits at coastal sites, layers of marine sediment mixed with debris, deposited far inland by massive waves. The physical evidence of devastation is undeniable. Ashfall from Thera has been identified across Crete, thin layers of volcanic material in soil cores. The theory was elegant. The volcano destroyed Minoan civilization around 1600 BCE, case closed. Except for one problem: the dates don't match. Modern radiocarbon dating and analysis of tree rings from wood buried in the eruption have pinpointed when Thera exploded, around 1600 BCE, possibly 1628 BCE, based on climate anomalies recorded in ice cores and tree rings worldwide. That date is solid. But Minoan civilization didn't end in 1600 BCE. The palaces didn't burn then. The culture didn't vanish then. Minoan civilization continued for another 150 years. Archaeological evidence shows that after the Thera eruption, the Minoans rebuilt. Damaged structures were repaired. New construction occurred. Trade continued, perhaps even expanded. Pottery styles evolved. Art flourished in some ways. The post-Thera period shows Minoan civilization at its strongest, as if they deabsorbed the disaster and adapted. So if the volcano didn't destroy them, what did around 1450 BCE, a century and a half after Thera, Minoan civilization abruptly ended? Palaces burned. Settlements were abandoned. The culture transformed almost overnight. Linear A script used by Minoans was replaced by Linear B, used by Mycenaean Greeks. Art styles shifted from flowing naturalism to rigid geometric patterns. Burial customs changed. Weapons became prominent in archaeological contexts where they'd been rare before. The second theory emerged: Mycenaean conquest. Warriors from mainland Greece invaded Crete, destroyed the palaces, subjugated the population, imposed their culture. The evidence seems clear. Mycenaean cultural elements appear suddenly in Crete precisely when Minoan elements disappear. Linear B tablets found at Knossos are clearly Mycenaean administrative records, written in an early form of Greek. This theory should work. Conquest explains sudden cultural change. Military invasion explains burned palaces. The Mycenaeans were known warriors. The Minoans were relatively peaceful. The strong conquered the weak, as happened countless times in history. But there is a problem with this theory too, one that archaeologists noticed as excavations continued. Where is the battle? If Crete was conquered, where are the weapon caches suggesting preparation for defense? Where are the hastily reinforced walls? Where are the mass graves of defenders who died protecting their homes? The destruction layers show fire, but not warfare. Palaces burned, but many show signs of having been systematically emptied before the fires. Valuables removed, rooms cleared, as if someone carefully decommissioned the buildings before burning them. Some excavations suggest even stranger possibilities. Walls dismantled carefully, not smashed by attackers. Storage rooms emptied methodically, not looted chaotically. Evidence that at some sites the destruction was deliberate but not hostile, more like demolition than devastation. The volcano should have ended them, but they survived and rebuilt. What destroyed them 150 years later left no bodies, no weapons, no clear signs of the invasion that supposedly happened. Just burned palaces and a culture that vanished overnight, leaving behind the unsettling suggestion that perhaps the Minoans participated in their own ending. Look closer at the decades between Thera-S eruption and the final collapse, and you see something more disturbing than conquest. You see a civilization slowly coming apart from within. The Minoans rebuilt after the volcano, palaces were repaired, life continued. But the repairs tell a story. Where original construction used precisely cut stone blocks fitted together without mortar. Repairs used rougher stones held together with mud. Where original frescoes showed sophisticated artistry with multiple colors and naturalistic detail. Later frescoes became simpler, more stylized, less innovative. The craftsmanship declined. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually, as if each generation maintained slightly lower standards than the one before. Trade networks that had once stretched from Egypt to Spain began contracting. Minoan pottery, once found across the Mediterranean, appears less frequently in distant sites after 1600 BCE. Imports to Crete declined. Exotic materials that had flowed freely into palace workshops became scarcer. This wasn't immediate collapse, but slow economic strangulation. The arteries that had fed Minoan prosperity were hardening. And something else changed, something fundamental to Minoan identity. They had been a relatively peaceful people. Their art celebrated nature and joy. Their palaces lacked the heavy fortifications common in other Bronze Age civilizations. But in the final decades, weapons become more common in archaeological contexts. Not just ceremonial weapons, but functional spearheads, daggers, arrowheads. Defensive walls appear at settlements that had never needed them before. The walls are crude, hastily built, suggesting urgency rather than planning. The art shifts too. The dolphins and flowers don't entirely disappear, but they rejoined by darker imagery, more martial themes, more somber tones. It is as if the culture that had once celebrated the beauty of the natural world was slowly forgetting how to celebrate anything. Linear tablets from the period just before the collapse reveal another troubling pattern. The administrative records become more complex, more detailed, more obsessive, more taxation records, more inventories, more centralized control. This is the archaeology of a society trying to manage crisis through bureaucracy, attempting to control through paperwork what it can no longer control through shared social bonds. When civilizations start drowning in administrative complexity, it often means the informal systems that actually make societies function are breaking down. But here is where the story gets truly strange. When the end came, when the palaces burned, and Mycenaean culture replaced Minoan culture almost overnight. Genetic evidence shows that the population did dramatically change. The Mycenaeans did wipe out the Minoans and replace them. Many Minoans remained on Crete, living under new cultural norms, adopting new customs, and linguistic analysis of Linear B, the Mycenaean script, shows it adopted many symbols from Linear A. The conquerors borrowed from the conquered. Mycenaean culture absorbed Minoan elements even as it dominated. Archaeological evidence suggests some Minoan elites maintained positions of authority under Mycenaean rule. This wasn't total conquest and subjugation. This was something more complex, almost collaborative. What if Minoan society had fragmented so severely that some Minoans welcomed Mycenaean intervention? What if the takeover wasn't entirely forced but partly invited? As different factions sought external allies in internal conflicts. Consider what the Thera eruption might have done to Minoan psychology. They survived the physical disaster, yes. They rebuilt the damaged structures, but did they ever truly recover? Their ships had dominated the Mediterranean, carrying them to prosperity. Then the sea rose up in waves taller than their palaces and destroyed coastal settlements. Their religion centered on nature, benevolence, bulls and dolphins and flowers. Then nature revealed its capacity for annihilation. Evidence suggests their religious practices changed after Thera. New deities appear in the archaeological record. Sacrifice rituals become more desperate, more frequent. Temples are built that seem designed to appease angry gods rather than celebrate friendly ones. Perhaps the Minoans never fully trusted their world again after witnessing what Thera could do. Refugees from destroyed coastal settlements would have strained inland resources. Trade routes disrupted by the tsunamis would have taken years to re-establish. The psychological trauma of survivors watching entire communities swallowed by waves doesn't appear in pottery styles or palace architecture, but it leaves marks nonetheless. Marks on a civilization's soul. And then there is the skeletal evidence that might be most disturbing. Analysis of bones from late Minoan sites shows signs of nutritional stress and disease, not famine. The granaries still had food, not drought. Water sources remained adequate, but as if the social systems that distributed resources had broken down. As if people were going hungry while storage rooms stayed full, dying of disease while medicine was available. The infrastructure of civilization was intact, but the will to maintain it had eroded. Perhaps what ended the Minoans wasn't Mycenaean swords, but Minoan exhaustion. Perhaps after decades of trying to rebuild what Thera had damaged, of managing increasing complexity with decreasing resources, of defending settlements that had never needed defending, of appeasing gods who had proven themselves unappeasable, they simply lost faith in their own civilization. The Mycenaeans didn't conquer Crete so much as inherit it. They walked into palaces already half abandoned, claimed authority over people already searching for new leadership, imposed their culture on a society that had stopped defending its own. Perhaps the Minoans weren't conquered. Perhaps they simply stopped believing in themselves, and the Mycenaeans just walked into the ruins of a culture that had already surrendered. Angkor Wat covers more than 400 acres. Walk its perimeter, and you'll travel nearly a mile. Its central tower rises 200 feet above the jungle floor, visible for miles across the Cambodian plains. It is the largest religious monument ever built by human hands, constructed in the 12th century when Europe was still building modest cathedrals and most of the world lived in villages. But Angkor Wat was just the crown jewel of something far larger. The Khmer Empire at its height controlled much of Southeast Asia, modern Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. At its center was Angkor, a sprawling urban complex covering nearly 1,000 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, it was larger than modern Los Angeles. 1 million people lived there, sustained by engineering that turned swampland into paradise. The secret was water. Cambodia's climate brings intense monsoons, months of torrential rain followed by months of drought. The Khmer didn't fight this cycle, they engineered it. They built massive reservoirs called barays, some large enough to be called artificial lakes. They constructed hundreds of miles of canals connecting these reservoirs to rice fields. They created distribution systems that captured monsoon floods, stored the water, then released it during dry seasons. The system was so sophisticated it allowed 3 rice harvests per year, triple what nature alone would provide. This abundance generated almost unimaginable wealth. Chinese diplomats who visited Angkor in the 13th century wrote accounts that seem like fantasy. They described streets paved with gold, temples whose towers were encrusted with gems, processions of thousands of elephants bearing tribute from vassal kingdoms. Even allowing for diplomatic exaggeration, the archaeological evidence supports their amazement. The Khmer built hundreds of temples, each requiring decades of labor. They carved bas-reliefs, covering acres of wall space. They moved stones weighing tons without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. For centuries they ruled. For centuries the water system sustained them. For centuries Angkor seemed eternal. By the early 15th century it was empty. When French explorers stumbled upon Angkor Wat in the 1860s, they found temples buried under jungle, so thick that massive stone towers were invisible from 100 feet away. Tree roots had split apart walls. Vines covered carved faces. The forest had reclaimed everything. Local people living in villages nearby had no memory of who built the temples, no stories passed down through generations. The greatest city in Southeast Asia had been forgotten so completely that its rediscovery shocked the world. This is what makes Angkor particularly mysterious. Unlike the Indus Valley or the Minoans, this wasn't ancient history. This was medieval. Contemporary Chinese records document trade with the Khmer Empire, diplomatic exchanges, detailed observations. Then those records simply stop mentioning Angkor, as if the empire ceased to exist almost overnight. Neighboring kingdoms that had sent tribute for centuries suddenly act as if the Khmer never existed. 1 million people lived in humanity's largest pre-industrial city. They had turned swampland into agricultural paradise. They built temples that touched the clouds. Their empire had endured for centuries, seemingly invincible. Then the jungle swallowed everything, and even memory was erased by the green. What force could cause such complete abandonment? What could make 1 million people walk away from paradise? In 2012, archaeologists flew over Angkor with LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology that penetrates jungle canopy to map what lies beneath. What they discovered changed everything we thought we knew about the city's scale. Beneath the green, invisible from the ground, they found a hydraulic network of staggering complexity. Hundreds of kilometers of canals, massive reservoirs capable of holding millions of cubic meters of water, distribution channels feeding thousands of individual rice fields, roads and embankments connecting it all into a single integrated system. This wasn't a city with some water infrastructure. This was a machine, every component precisely engineered to capture, store, and distribute water with calculated efficiency. And machines require maintenance. The canals needed constant dredging. Silt washes downstream during monsoons, accumulating in channels, reducing flow. Leave a canal unmaintained for a few years and it becomes a shallow ditch, useless for irrigation. The embankments needed reinforcement. Water pressure erodes earthworks. A weak point in an embankment can become a breach, flooding fields and homes. The gates controlling water flow between different systems needed precise operation. Open the wrong gate at the wrong time and you flood districts that should be dry, or leave districts dry that need water. The Khmer had turned Angkor's natural water cycle into artificial infrastructure. It sustained 1 million people, generated wealth beyond measure, produced 3 rice harvests annually, but it demanded perpetual attention. The moment maintenance stopped, the system began failing, and in the 14th century maintenance became impossible. Sediment cores drilled from the ancient reservoirs tell a story of abrupt change. For centuries, sediment layers show steady accumulation at predictable rates. Then, in the 1300s, the pattern shifts violently. Some years show massive sediment deposits indicating catastrophic floods. Other years show almost no accumulation, suggesting severe drought. The cores preserve evidence of whiplash climate, extremes oscillating year to year, making prediction impossible. Tree ring data from across Southeast Asia confirms it. The 14th century brought dramatic monsoon variability. Some years rainfall was twice normal levels. Overwhelming reservoirs, destroying canals, flooding the city. Other years brought severe drought, emptying the reservoirs that were supposed to sustain agriculture through dry seasons. The system had been engineered for predictable cycles. It could handle chaos. Evidence of failure appears across Angkor, canal systems clogged with debris from floods. Embankments breached and never repaired, reservoirs that should have been maintained at specific levels showing dramatic fluctuations. The LiDAR reveals it clearly. In the final decades, large sections of the hydraulic network simply stopped functioning, and here is where the cascading failures began. A flood damages a key canal. Districts dependent on that canal for irrigation produce less rice. Food stress increases. Labor that should be maintaining other parts of the system gets diverted to emergency repairs on the damaged section. But while everyone focuses on one crisis, other canals go unmaintained, leading to new failures. Each failure demands more emergency response, pulling labor from routine maintenance, creating more failures. The inscriptions from this period are telling kings boast about building new, larger reservoirs, more elaborate canal systems, more complex engineering. They responded to system failure by adding more complexity, apparently believing that bigger, more sophisticated infrastructure would solve the problems smaller systems could handle. They doubled down on the engineering approach that was failing, but larger reservoirs were more vulnerable to flooding. More complex canal networks required more maintenance. Adding complexity to a failing system only accelerated the failure. Contemporary diplomatic records from China note that Khmer power was declining in the 14th century, even as inscriptions in Angkor itself boasted of greatness. The disconnect suggests rulers out of touch with reality, proclaiming triumph while their civilization crumbled. Archaeological evidence indicates Angkor's population may have exceeded what the water system could sustainably support. In good years, with optimal monsoons and perfect maintenance, it worked. But there was no margin for error. The city had committed what ecologists call overshoot, growing beyond the capacity of its life support system. And when the system began failing, people responded rationally. They left, not in panic, not overnight. Evidence shows abandonment starting in peripheral neighborhoods, gradually spreading inward. People didn't flee catastrophe. They made calculated decisions. When the engineering that made urban life possible began demanding more labor than it returned in benefits, they chose village life elsewhere, simpler, more resilient, less dependent on infrastructure that required armies of workers to maintain. But each departure made the situation worse for those who remained. Fewer people meant less labor for maintenance. Less maintenance meant more system failures. More failures drove more departures. A death spiral driven by rational individual choices that collectively destroyed what they'd built. They spent centuries perfecting the most sophisticated water system in the pre-industrial world. That perfection trapped them. When the climate shifted, their triumph became their tomb. The Khmer kings weren't just rulers. They were Devarajas, god kings, living embodiments of divine power. The concept was central to everything Angkor represented. The king's spiritual authority maintained cosmic order. His power ensured the monsoons came on schedule. The harvests were bountiful. The kingdom prospered. The temples weren't just religious buildings. They were machines for generating and channeling spiritual power that sustained the entire civilization. When the water systems began failing, this created more than an engineering crisis. It created a theological catastrophe. If the king was divine, if his power maintained order, why were the gods withdrawing their favor? Why did the monsoons bring chaos instead of predictable cycles? Why did the canals fail? Why did the reservoirs overflow or run dry? The system that had worked for centuries was breaking down, and the very foundation of political authority, the god-king's divine connection, was being called into question. Evidence of religious crisis appears in the archaeological record. For centuries, Angkor had been Hindu, its temples dedicated to Vishnu and Shiva, but in the final century, inscriptions show a dramatic shift toward Theravada Buddhism. This wasn't gradual religious evolution. This was people searching desperately for new spiritual explanations for their troubles, turning to different gods when the old ones seemed to have abandoned them. The kings responded the only way their theology allowed. They built more temples. Inscriptions from the 14th century show monarchs frantically commissioning religious architecture, apparently believing that grander temples would restore divine favor. But every temple required labor. Thousands of workers quarrying stone, transporting materials, carving reliefs, constructing towers. Labor that could have been maintaining the canals, dredging the reservoirs, reinforcing the embankments. Another doom loop, the solution to divine disfavor, was religious construction. But religious construction diverted resources from infrastructure maintenance, which caused more system failures, which suggested even greater divine disfavor, which demanded even more temple building. The inscriptions themselves reveal the declining power of the state. Earlier inscriptions are grand proclamations covering entire walls, listing the king's titles, describing his divine lineage, cataloguing his achievements. Later inscriptions become shorter, less elaborate, more desperate. Kings still proclaim greatness, but the archaeology tells a different story. Evidence of social fragmentation appears across the empire. Local strongmen begin appearing in the record. Regional leaders who once deferred to Angkor's central authority now acting independently. Political power was decentralizing, the tight control that had maintained the water system for centuries fragmenting into competing interests. In such conditions, maintaining infrastructure that benefits everyone becomes nearly impossible when local leaders prioritize their own districts. And then there is the military evidence. In the late 14th century, Siam, the kingdom to Angkor's west, began raiding Khmer territory. These raids weren't attempts at conquest. Siamese armies would strike, loot temples and cities, then withdraw. They came for treasure, not territory. This pattern is revealing. Angkor still had wealth worth stealing, but apparently lacked the military strength to prevent raids or the political stability to make occupation worthwhile. It was an empire dying, but not yet dead, valuable enough to plunder but too weak to defend itself or too chaotic to govern. But here is what isotope analysis of human remains reveals. People in late period Angkor were moving. Chemical signatures in bones show individuals who grew up in rural areas living in the city, and city dwellers who moved to rural regions. This wasn't a trapped urban population, unable to escape. People had mobility, they had options, and increasingly they chose to leave. This is what historians call voting with their feet, when a civilization's social contract breaks down so thoroughly that people simply opt out. Urban life in Angkor had once offered clear benefits: safety in numbers, access to markets, participation in grand religious festivals, connection to a powerful empire. But when the water system failed, when food became uncertain, when raids threatened, when the god kings seemed to have lost heaven's mandate, urban life offered mainly complexity and vulnerability. Village life elsewhere offered simplicity and resilience. Grow your own rice using rain-fed fields that don't depend on canal systems. Form communities small enough to defend. Live without the crushing labor demands of maintaining infrastructure or building temples. The choice became obvious to more and more people. Archaeological evidence shows that in Angkor's final decades, a much reduced population still occupied the core city. They maintained the central temples. Angkor Wat itself was never completely abandoned. But vast residential districts emptied, the hydraulic network fell into disrepair, markets closed. The great urban experiment dissolved back into scattered villages. When Siamese armies finally captured Angkor in 1431, they found what was essentially a ghost city. A skeleton crew of priests maintained temples in a landscape of abandoned homes and clogged canals. The capture was more symbolic than strategic. The real Angkor had already died, and then the jungle came. Tropical vegetation grows fast. Within a generation, trees pushed through plaza stones, vines covered carved walls, roots split apart foundations. The forest, held back for centuries by constant human maintenance, reclaimed its territory with astonishing speed. Massive stone temples disappeared under green, so thick they became invisible from 100 feet away. The tropical environment had been waiting patiently for centuries to take back what humans had temporarily borrowed. The god kings kept building temples while their people quietly walked away. When the Siamese army finally arrived, they found a city that had already surrendered to the green. Stand at the base of the cliff and look up. 200 feet above, built into a natural alcove in the sandstone face, you see walls, not ruins. Walls, multi-story apartment complexes constructed with such precision that after 700 years they still stand, protected from rain by the cliff overhang, Mesa Verde. Cliff Palace, a city built into the sky. This wasn't a simple cave dwelling. These were engineered structures, hundreds of rooms arranged in careful layouts, multiple stories connected by interior ladders, plaster still smooth on walls where you can see the fingerprints of the people who applied it. Some rooms were living spaces, others were storage. Still, others were kivas, circular ceremonial chambers built into the ground, their walls painted with symbols we only beginning to understand. The ancestral Puebloans, once called Anasazi, until that term was recognized as a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies, flourished in the American Southwest between 900 and 1300 CE. They chose to live in one of North America's harshest environments: high desert plateau, scarce rainfall, extreme temperature swings, growing seasons measured in months, not years. Yet they didn't just survive. They thrived. Their agricultural engineering was remarkable. They built extensive canal systems to capture and distribute the little rainfall that fell. They constructed check dams at carefully calculated positions to slow runoff and allow soil to absorb moisture. They developed varieties of corn that could mature in 90 days, adapted to short growing seasons. They terraced hillsides to prevent erosion and conserve water. Every innovation represented generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving in a landscape that offered little margin for error. Chaco Canyon served as their ceremonial and economic center. The great houses there, massive structures containing hundreds of rooms, show astronomical alignments, windows positioned to mark solstices and equinoxes with shafts of light. The ancestral Puebloans tracked celestial cycles with precision, timing their planting and ceremonies to movements of sun and stars. Roads up to 30 feet wide connected Chaco to outlying communities as far as 60 miles away. 400 miles of engineered roads for a culture without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden. People walked these roads carrying goods for trade: turquoise from local mines, macaw feathers from Mesoamerica, 1,000 miles south, shells from Pacific and Gulf coasts. This was a complex, interconnected society. Their pottery shows sophisticated artistry, geometric patterns painted with brushes made from yucca fibers. Their textiles were woven with skill that rivals modern production. They created beauty in a harsh land, built permanence in sandstone and adobe. And then around 1300 CE they left. The cliff dwellings were abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, abandoned. People sealed doors and windows from the outside, plastering over entries as if securing homes they expected to return to, but they never came back. Belongings remained in rooms, pottery shards, worn tools, even food storage vessels. These weren't temporary camps casually discarded. These were permanent homes where families had lived for generations, where children had grown up, where communities had invested enormous collective labor in construction and maintenance. The mystery isn't where they went. We know that. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblos. Genetic, linguistic, and cultural evidence connects them directly to the cliff dwellers. The mystery is why they left. Why abandon cities that touch the sky? Why walk away from homes their ancestors had built across 13 generations? Why seal the doors from outside and never return? Tree rings don't lie. Cores extracted from ancient logs preserved in ancestral Puebloan sites tell a precise story of rainfall year by year, decade by decade. The rings are narrow in dry years when growth slows, wider in wet years when moisture is abundant. And the rings from 1276 to 1299 are thin, sometimes barely visible. Those 2 decades represent one of the most severe megadroughts in North American history, the Great Drought that seemed to doom the cliff dwellers. The case appears simple. Agriculture in the high desert depends on adequate rainfall. The drought devastated crops. Food became scarce. People abandoned homes that could sustain them. Environmental catastrophe explains abandonment. Mystery solved, except for the inconsistencies. The ancestral Puebloans had survived droughts before. Tree ring records show earlier dry periods nearly as severe. Droughts in the 1130s and 1180s that lasted years. Yet people didn't abandon the cliff dwellings then. They adapted, tightened their belts, relied on stored food and endured. Why was the Great Drought different? What made this particular environmental stress unbearable when earlier droughts were survivable? The timing doesn't match either. Abandonment began before the drought peaked. Some sites show evidence of departure in the early 1270s before the worst years arrived, and abandonment continued into the early 1300s as, after tree rings show rainfall partially recovering. If drought was the sole cause, you'd expect people to leave during the worst years and return when conditions improved. But they didn't return. Even stranger, some of the richest agricultural areas were abandoned first. Sites with reliable water sources and fertile soil emptied while marginal settlements in less productive areas remained occupied longer. If people were fleeing agricultural failure, this pattern makes no sense. You expect them to abandon marginal areas first and cling to the best farmland as long as possible. And then there is the violence. Archaeological evidence from the final decades shows troubling patterns. Towers that appear designed for defense, built hastily with lookout positions. Burials in unusual locations. People interred quickly in trash middens or under room floors instead of proper cemeteries, suggesting hasty disposal during crisis. Some skeletons show evidence of violent death. Skulls with depressed fractures from blunt weapons, cut marks suggesting scalping, injuries inconsistent with accidents. At a few sites, archaeologists have found even more disturbing evidence. Human bones showing butchery marks similar to those on animal bones, suggesting possible cannibalism. This evidence remains controversial. Some researchers argue the marks indicate violence, not consumption. Others suggest ritualistic treatment of the dead rather than survival cannibalism. But the bones show something traumatic happened during the abandonment period. The archaeological evidence suggests a society tearing itself apart, not a peaceful migration but social fracture accompanied by violence. Yet here is what deepens the mystery: there aren't enough bodies. If violence was widespread, if communities were attacking each other over scarce resources, where are the mass graves? Where are the burned settlements full of casualties? The evidence shows violence occurred, but not on the scale you'd expect if warfare destroyed the society. Recent theories suggest the drought didn't just reduce food. It broke down the social cooperation that prevented conflict. The ancestral Puebloans lived in densely populated areas where survival required coordination. They shared limited water sources. They hunted communally. They maintained irrigation systems through collective labor. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. Evidence from Chaco Canyon shows increasing inequality in the decades before abandonment. Elite residences contain exotic trade goods, macaw feathers, copper bells, turquoise jewelry. Meanwhile, skeletal analysis of common people shows nutritional stress, enamel defects on teeth indicating childhood malnutrition, bone density suggesting dietary deficiency. The social contract was fraying. When environmental stress hit, the bonds holding society together snapped. But oral histories from modern Pueblo peoples tell a different story. In their traditions, the abandonment wasn't about drought or violence. It was about spiritual crisis. The ancestors had fallen out of balance with the natural world. Internal conflicts had violated sacred protocols. They needed to leave their homes and begin again, to restore harmony through migration and renewal. The drought should explain everything, but they survived drought before. This time something else broke. Something that left violence in the ruins, but took the bodies with it. Ask the Hopi why their ancestors left the cliff dwellings, and they won't tell you about drought. They'll tell you about prophecy, about sacred migration, about a journey that was always part of the plan. In Hopi oral tradition, the ancestors didn't abandon their homes, they completed them. The cliff-dwelling period was one phase in a longer spiritual journey that began in the distant past and continues into the future. The people were meant to move, to occupy different lands for specific periods, to learn lessons in each place before continuing. The departure from Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon wasn't catastrophe. It was fulfillment of prophecy. Zuni traditions describe similar concepts, stories of scout groups sent to find new lands, accounts of elders reading signs that indicated when the time had come to leave. Rio Grande Pueblo oral histories speak of ceremonies performed to close the old homes properly, rituals to thank the land and release the people from their obligations to those places. These aren't vague myths. They're detailed accounts passed down through generations, encoded in religious practices and origin stories. Hopi migration narratives describe specific routes, specific stopping points, even specific disputes about which direction to travel. This is cultural memory preserved through oral tradition with remarkable consistency across different Pueblo groups. What makes this perspective powerful is how it reframes everything. From a Western archaeological viewpoint, abandonment suggests failure, people forced to leave by circumstances beyond their control. But from a Pueblo perspective, departure was intentional, purposeful, part of a sacred pattern of migration that defined their cultural identity. And when you examine the archaeological evidence through this lens, you find intriguing support. Many cliff-dwelling sites show signs of intentional decommissioning. Valuable items, pottery, tools, ceremonial objects were carefully cached in specific locations, often beneath floors or in sealed rooms. This isn't the archaeology of panicked flight where people grab what they can carry and run. This is methodical storage, as if items were being preserved for a return that everyone knew wouldn't happen, or being deliberately left as offerings. Doors and windows were sealed from the outside with stone and plaster, not barricaded hastily, but carefully closed, plastered smooth. Kivas, the circular ceremonial chambers central to Puebloan religious life, show evidence of ritual closing. Final ceremonies were performed, sacred items removed, entries sealed. This suggests organized departure, following cultural protocols. The archaeological evidence fits the oral tradition in many ways. The departure does appear planned and deliberate, not desperate evacuation. People took time to prepare, to close their homes properly, to cache valuables according to specific patterns. But the oral tradition doesn't emphasize the violence. And the violence is there in the archaeological record. The defensive structures, the traumatic injuries, the hasty burials. How do we reconcile these different narratives? Perhaps the departure was contentious. Perhaps some factions wanted to leave while others wanted to stay. Perhaps communities fragmented over the decision, leading to conflicts that scarred the final decades. The survivors, those who successfully migrated and established new communities, would naturally emphasize the purposeful aspects of the journey in their oral traditions. The violence, the disputes, the trauma might fade from collective memory over generations, smoothed into stories of prophecy fulfilled and sacred migration completed. This happens in human memory. Traumatic events get reframed in collective storytelling, not through dishonesty, but through the natural process of cultural memory, which preserves what matters most to group identity and lets painful details recede. Genetic and linguistic evidence shows that modern Pueblo peoples are indeed descendants of the cliff dwellers. DNA extracted from ancient ancestral Puebloan burials connects directly to modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande populations. Linguistic analysis traces Puebloan languages back to the cliff-dwelling period. Cultural practices, pottery techniques, weaving patterns, agricultural methods, ceremonial cycles show clear continuity across the centuries. But the migration wasn't simple. The refugees didn't move as unified groups following single leaders to predetermined destinations. Different clans scattered in different directions. Some joined existing villages, integrating with other peoples. Some founded new settlements. Some wandered for generations before finding permanent homes. The diaspora was complex, messy, human. Yet through all that dispersal and disruption, cultural identity survived. Pottery styles characteristic of cliff-dwelling communities appear in later Rio Grande pueblos. Kiva architecture follows patterns established at Chaco Canyon. Agricultural techniques developed in Mesa Verde persist in Hopi fields today. The stories survived. The ceremonies survived. The core identity survived. This stands in striking contrast to the Indus Valley, where people abandoned not just cities but apparently forgot they'd ever been urban. The ancestral Puebloans left their cliff dwellings but never forgot who they were. They carried their culture with them through the migration, preserving it in stories and practices rather than buildings and monuments. Perhaps the mystery of abandonment is partly Western obsession with permanence. The idea that people should stay in one place forever, that moving represents failure, that proper civilizations build permanent cities and remain in them. These are European agricultural concepts. Puebloan cosmology apparently included different ideas about place and movement, about the proper relationship between people and land, about when to stay and when to go. The cliff dwellings stand empty now, silent except for wind through the rooms where families once lived, but the people didn't vanish. Their descendants live in pueblos across New Mexico and Arizona, still telling the stories, still practicing the ceremonies, still maintaining the cultural identity that survived the journey. They didn't forget who they were, they just left behind the walls and kept the stories. But the ruins still whisper a darker tale than the descendants remember. Before the Maya built their towering pyramids, before the Aztecs ruled their empire, before Teotihuacan rose to dominance, there were the Olmecs. Mesoamerica's first complex civilization flourished along Mexico's Gulf Coast from roughly 1600 to 400 BCE, creating almost everything we associate with later Mexican cultures, and then vanishing so completely that for 2,000 years no one remembered they had ever existed. They invented the Mesoamerican long count calendar, the sophisticated system that would later allow Maya astronomers to calculate celestial events thousands of years into the future. They developed the first writing system in the Americas, carving glyphs that we still can fully decipher. They played the ritual ball game in formal courts centuries before the sport spread across Mesoamerica. They built stepped pyramids when most of the Americas still relied on simple earthen mounds. And they carved colossal stone heads. 17 have been discovered so far, each unique, each clearly portraying a specific individual. The smallest weighs 6 tons, the largest weighs over 40 tons, as much as 8 elephants, carved from single basalt boulders, transported 50 to 100 miles from the Tuxtla Mountains to Olmec cities without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. Look closely at the faces and you see distinct features, broad noses, full lips, elaborate headdresses that might indicate rank or identity. These weren't generic monuments, they were portraits of rulers, each requiring thousands of hours of labor to quarry, carve, and move. The organizational capacity required is staggering. Someone had to coordinate hundreds, perhaps thousands of workers. Someone had to plan transportation routes across difficult terrain. Someone had to feed and house the labor force for months or years. This was centralized authority on a scale that shouldn't have existed in 1200 BCE. The Olmecs created urban centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres, Zapotes, with populations in the thousands. They established trade networks reaching hundreds of miles, bringing jade from Guatemala highlands and obsidian from central Mexico. Their distinctive art style, that combination of naturalistic human features with stylized supernatural elements, the famous jaguar motifs, is instantly recognizable. They created a visual vocabulary that would influence Mesoamerican art for millennia. For over 1,000 years, they were the dominant cultural force in the region. Then, around 400 BCE, they simply ended. Cities were abandoned. The distinctive art style disappeared. The cultural influence evaporated. And here is what makes the Olmec disappearance profoundly different from every other vanished civilization we've examined. They were forgotten, completely, utterly. For 2,000 years, when the Maya built their great cities, they apparently knew nothing about the Olmecs who had invented the calendar system they used. When the Aztecs conquered central Mexico, they had no legends, no historical records, no oral traditions mentioning the people who had pioneered Mesoamerican civilization. When Spanish conquistadors asked about ancient ruins, indigenous peoples had no stories explaining who built them. Archaeologists began discovering Olmec sites in the 19th century and found a civilization with no name. We don't know what the Olmecs called themselves. The word Olmec comes from an Aztec term meaning rubber people, a reference to the rubber producing region where they lived, assigned by modern scholars because we have no other name to use. How does this happen? How does a civilization that shaped an entire region's cultural development for over 1,000 years become so thoroughly forgotten that even its name vanishes? The ancestral Puebloans are remembered by their descendants. The Indus Valley people at least left traces in genetic memory. But the Olmecs, the mother culture of Mesoamerica, disappeared so completely that for 2 millennia it was as if they had never existed at all. The faces stare at you across millennia. 17 colossal heads discovered so far, each carved from a single basalt boulder, each weighing between 6 and 50 tons. But what is striking isn't their size, it is their individuality. Look closely and you see distinct people. One head shows a stern expression, jaw set, eyes narrowed. Another appears almost serene, lips slightly upturned. Each has unique facial features, different nose shapes, different ear ornaments, different patterns on the elaborate headdresses. These aren't generic representations of rulers. They re-portraits of specific individuals carved with enough detail that if you saw these people walking down a street, you might recognize them. The labor investment is staggering. Carving a 40-ton head from solid basalt would take skilled sculptors months, perhaps years. Then came transportation, 50 to 100 kilometers from the Tuxtla Mountain, quarries to Olmec cities, across rivers and swamps, without wheels or draft animals. Each head represents thousands of man-hours, coordinated effort on a massive scale, resources devoted to commemorating individual rulers. This was centralized authority. This was power. But here is the disturbing detail that archaeologists noticed as excavations continued. Many of these magnificent monuments were deliberately destroyed, not by enemies, by the Olmecs themselves. Heads were defaced, features chipped away with careful precision. Some were toppled and buried in elaborate patterns, surrounded by offerings, as if the destruction was ritualistic rather than hostile. Across Olmec sites you find evidence of systematic monument destruction. Sculptures broken into specific pieces, thrones dismantled, stelae shattered and carefully interred. This wasn't vandalism, this was ceremony. And it complicates everything we thought we understood about Olmec collapse. The archaeological record reveals sophisticated engineering beyond the famous heads. Drainage systems in San Lorenzo channeled water through elaborate stone-lined conduits. Artificial pools created reflective surfaces for ceremonial purposes. Raised field systems in swampy terrain allowed agriculture where it shouldn't have been possible. Trade networks brought jade from Guatemala highlands hundreds of miles away, obsidian from central Mexican sources, shells from distant coasts. The Olmecs weren't struggling, they were thriving, innovating, expanding. Then came 900 BCE. San Lorenzo, the greatest Olmec center, was systematically destroyed. Monuments were broken and buried in patterns, suggesting ritual rather than warfare. For decades, archaeologists thought this marked the end of Olmec civilization, but it didn't. It marked transformation. Power shifted to Leventa, which became the new ceremonial center. The culture continued, evolved, persisted for another 500 years. The destruction at San Lorenzo wasn't collapse but deliberate transition, as if relocating the center of power required ritually killing the old one. This pattern of intentional site decommissioning followed by cultural continuation suggests something important. The Olmecs had a concept of ritual transformation, of ending one phase to begin another. They knew how to close ceremonial centers properly, to bury the old and build the new. The actual end of Olmec civilization around 400 BCE was far less dramatic. No spectacular monument destruction marks this transition. Instead, sites simply phased out of use. The final Olmec settlements show declining material culture, simpler pottery, less elaborate architecture, reduced artistic sophistication. This looks like gradual devolution, not sudden catastrophe. People didn't flee disaster. They slowly stopped maintaining Olmec cultural practices, stopped building in Olmec style, stopped creating monuments. Gradual cultural decline is normal. Civilizations transform, simplify, evolve into something else. What happened to the Olmecs archaeologically isn't particularly mysterious. What is mysterious is what happened to their memory. The Maya would eventually build great cities throughout the region the Olmecs once dominated. They would use calendrical systems the Olmecs invented, play ball games the Olmecs pioneered, carved glyphs descended from Olmec writing. Yet Maya historical records contain no mention of the people who created these innovations. The Aztecs would conquer central Mexico, establish an empire, develop sophisticated historical traditions recorded in codices. Yet they apparently knew nothing about the Olmecs whose cultural influence had shaped Mesoamerica for over 1,000 years. They deliberately destroyed their own monuments, buried their gods in careful rituals, then quietly faded away. But that doesn't explain how later civilizations forgot they ever existed. Here is the paradox that should be impossible. The Maya used a calendar system invented by the Olmecs. They played the ball game the Olmecs pioneered. Their art incorporated motifs the Olmecs created. Their writing descended from Olmec glyphs. Yet Maya historical records carved on monuments painted in codices preserved in oral tradition never mention the Olmecs, not once, not even as mythical ancestors or defeated enemies or ancient rivals, just silence. The Aztecs built their empire across regions where Olmec influence had been strongest. They developed sophisticated historical traditions, recording events extending back centuries in elaborate codices. They remembered the Toltecs who came before them, spoke of ancient Teotihuacan with reverence, preserved stories about peoples who had vanished long before. Yet their complex historical memory somehow skipped entirely over the civilization that had invented many elements of Mesoamerican culture. The Olmecs simply don't exist in Aztec history. How does this happen? The first explanation seems obvious: time. 1500 to 2000 years separated the Aztecs from the Olmecs, roughly the same span between modern Americans and the Roman Empire. Without written records that survived, oral tradition rarely persists across such depths of time. Memory fades, stories change. Eventually the past dissolves into myth and then into nothing. But this explanation has a problem. The Aztecs did remember some very ancient events. Their codices recorded creation myths, migration stories, accounts of peoples and places from the distant past. Oral tradition can preserve information across impressive time spans when cultures actively work to maintain it. The Aztecs clearly valued historical knowledge and dedicated resources to preserving it. Yet the Olmecs, the mother culture, were absent from that carefully maintained record. Perhaps the forgetting was deliberate. Mesoamerican cultures practiced selective memory. The Aztecs routinely rewrote history to glorify themselves, erasing or diminishing predecessors who didn't fit their preferred narrative. When they conquered cities, they sometimes destroyed historical records and replaced them with versions emphasizing Aztec greatness. The Maya occasionally erased references to defeated rivals, chiseling out names from monuments, rewriting stelae to remove uncomfortable truths. Maybe the Olmecs fell victim to intentional cultural erasure. Later civilizations inherited Olmec innovations, but claimed to have invented them independently, deliberately forgetting the source to take credit for the achievements. This kind of historical theft isn't unusual. Conquerors and successors often appropriate the accomplishments of those they replace, writing origin stories that make themselves the creators rather than inheritors. But there is a third possibility, stranger and more intriguing. Perhaps the Olmecs themselves wanted to be forgotten. Return to the evidence of ritual monument destruction. Those colossal heads deliberately defaced and carefully buried. Sculptures broken according to specific patterns, interred with offerings. Sites systematically decommissioned through elaborate ceremonies. What if these weren't acts of defeat or conquest, but closing rituals? Proper ways to end a sacred place, a necessary forgetting. Some cultures practice ritual abandonment as spiritual protocol. Certain indigenous Australian groups forbid speaking the names of the dead, believing that memory can trap spirits and prevent their journey to the afterlife. Some Buddhist traditions create elaborate sand mandalas, intricate patterns requiring days of careful work, then deliberately destroy them to teach impermanence, to remind practitioners that nothing lasts and attachment to permanence causes suffering. Perhaps Olmec religion included similar concepts. Perhaps they believed sacred places had lifespans, that centers of power needed to be ritually killed and forgotten to allow renewal. Perhaps forgetting wasn't failure but practice, a way of relating to time and legacy fundamentally different from our modern obsession with permanence. Recent analysis of Olmec sites suggests they may have been periodically abandoned and reoccupied rather than continuously inhabited. San Lorenzo shows evidence of destruction followed by rebuilding, then destruction again. La Venta rose after San Lorenzo fell, continued the tradition, then was itself abandoned. This pattern of intentional destruction followed by relocation might indicate cultural renewal through forgetting, each generation deliberately leaving the past behind to begin again. If moving on and forgetting was central to Olmec worldview, it would explain both their gradual dissolution and their complete erasure from later memory. They wouldn't have fought to be remembered, because being remembered wasn't the goal. Their successors wouldn't have preserved Olmec memory, because the Olmecs themselves had established precedent for forgetting. This raises uncomfortable questions about memory and legacy. We assume civilizations want to be remembered, that leaving lasting monuments reflects universal human desires for immortality through achievement. But perhaps that is cultural bias. Perhaps some peoples viewed permanence differently, saw wisdom in letting go, practiced forgetting as spiritual discipline. Cultural memory is fragile. It requires constant active maintenance. Stories retold, monuments preserved, names repeated, histories recorded. When a culture stops fighting to be remembered, when successors have no incentive to preserve that memory, even great civilizations can fade into nameless artifacts. And this suggests something haunting. The Olmecs may not be unique. How many other first civilizations existed that we've completely forgotten? How many pre-Olmec cultures pioneered innovations we attribute to later peoples? How many times has human civilization reached complexity, achieved sophistication, then dissolved so thoroughly that not even memory remains? The archaeological record preserves only what survived. But memory is far more fragile than stone. Perhaps they weren't forgotten. Perhaps they chose to fade from memory, teaching their descendants that even the greatest empires should return to the earth and be forgotten. Picture the image: nearly 900 stone giants standing sentinel across a barren landscape, their backs to the sea, their eyes staring inland across an island stripped almost bare of trees. The Moai of Easter Island, Rapa Nui to its indigenous people, represent one of the most haunting archaeological mysteries on Earth. Some stand 33 feet tall. The largest weighs 82 tons, as much as 50 automobiles, carved from volcanic rock with stone tools, transported miles from quarries, erected on platforms using techniques we still debate. Nearly 900 of them scattered across an island, just 64 square miles in size, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. The nearest continent lies 300 miles away across open Pacific. The nearest inhabited island is over 1,000 miles distant. This was humanity's most extreme social experiment, a small population, perhaps 10 to 15,000 at peak, living in complete isolation, with no possibility of trade, no source of outside resources, no escape if things went wrong. Everything they needed had to come from the island itself. When Polynesians first arrived around 1200 CE, they found paradise. A subtropical island covered in palm forests, the trees reaching heights of 80 feet or more, fertile volcanic soil, abundant seabirds nesting in millions along the coasts and cliffs, fish in the surrounding waters, everything needed for survival. Within 500 years, they de-transformed paradise into desolation. The forests were clear, cut, every tree gone. The bird species were driven to extinction or fled to offshore islets. The soil, no longer held by tree roots, eroded away. The island became what Europeans found in 1722, a barren landscape of grass and stone, almost no trees, a few struggling crops, and stone giants staring at emptiness. For decades, Easter Island has served as the ultimate cautionary tale, the textbook example of ecocide, a civilization that destroyed itself through environmental mismanagement. They cut down the last tree, the story goes, in competitive frenzy to move ever larger statues, to outdo rival clans, to honor ancestors while ignoring the catastrophe they were creating. When the trees were gone, they could build boats to fish, they could escape. They descended into warfare and possibly cannibalism, their population crashing from 15,000 to perhaps 2,000 by the time Europeans arrived. It is a powerful narrative, a clear warning about what happens when societies exceed environmental limits. Scientists have pointed to Easter Island for generations as proof that civilizations can commit suicide through ecological destruction. But recent research has revealed something uncomfortable. This simple narrative is incomplete. In some ways, it is misleading. If the Rapa Nui destroyed their civilization through environmental catastrophe, how did they survive? When Europeans arrived in 1722, they found not a collapsed society, but a functioning 1,200 to 3,000 people living sustainably on what appeared to be a ruined island, growing crops, raising chickens, maintaining social structure, not thriving perhaps, but surviving, adapted, stable. Something doesn't add up. They carved nearly 900 stone giants and destroyed their paradise doing it. Or did they? What if everything we thought we knew about Easter Island's collapse is wrong? The deforestation is real. That part of the story is undeniable. Pollen cores drilled from lake sediments and swamps preserve a precise record of Easter Island's vegetation history. When Polynesians arrived around 1200 CE, the island supported extensive palm forests. A now extinct species called Pascalococos disperta, similar to Chilean wine palms, with trunks reaching 80 feet high and 2 feet thick. The pollen record shows these palms dominated the landscape for thousands of years before human arrival. By 1722, when Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to visit, virtually no trees remained, just grass, shrubs, and a few scattered Toromiro bushes. The transformation was total. The forests had vanished. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. The Rapa Nui cut down the trees to move their massive moai statues. The traditional narrative painted a picture of competitive religious fervor, rival clans trying to outdo each other with ever larger statues cutting more and more trees to roll the multi-ton monuments from quarries to platforms. More statues demanded more trees. The competition escalated until someone cut the last tree, destroying the ecosystem in pursuit of religious glory. It was civilizational suicide driven by cultural obsession. The story was elegant, moralistic, and wrong. First problem: experimental archaeology has shown that moai didn't need to be rolled on logs. In 2012, researchers successfully moved a replica moai using only ropes and coordinated team maneuvering, essentially walking the statue upright by rocking it side to side. The technique works because the statue's center of gravity, combined with their base shape, allows them to be moved this way with far fewer people and no timber at all. You need rope and coordination, not forest, clearing quantities of logs. Second problem, far more significant: rats. When Polynesians colonized Easter Island, they brought Polynesian rats, stowaways on canoes, unavoidable companions of Pacific migration. And rats, it turns out, love palm nuts. Fossils of Pascalococos nuts from archaeological sites show extensive gnaw marks. Every nut was attacked. Mathematical models suggest that in the absence of natural predators, rat populations could have exploded to several million within a few decades of arrival. Controlled studies of modern palm species show that rats can completely prevent forest regeneration. They eat every seed before it can germinate. Every single one. A palm tree might produce thousands of nuts over its lifetime, but if rats consume them all, the tree produces 0 offspring. The forest can regenerate even if humans stop cutting. So the actual story is far more complex. Humans did cut trees for construction, for firewood, for clearing agricultural land, possibly for moving some statues. But normal resource use by a small population shouldn't have caused total deforestation. What made it catastrophic was rats preventing regeneration. Trees that were cut could be replaced. The forest had no next generation, and there were other factors. Pollen analysis reveals something surprising. The forest was already declining before moai construction peaked. The timeline doesn't support the idea that statue building caused deforestation. If anything, environmental stress came first. Soil erosion studies show that Easter Island's thin volcanic soil eroded rapidly once tree cover was removed, washing into the ocean and taking fertility with it. Even if people had stopped cutting, even if rats had stopped eating seeds, reforestation would have been difficult once the soil was gone. Climate data adds another layer. The Little Ice Age brought cooler, drier conditions to the Pacific precisely when Easter Island was being deforested. The palms were already stressed by climate change when humans and rats arrived. The combination, climate stress plus human clearing plus rat predation plus soil loss, created a cascade no single factor alone would have triggered. The forest vanished not from reckless statue building but from complex interaction of multiple stresses, none individually catastrophic but deadly in combination. But here is what the traditional narrative gets most wrong. The Rapa Nui didn't die out, they adapted. Archaeological evidence shows agricultural intensification using lithic mulching, placing stones around plants to conserve soil moisture, a technique that works in the absence of forests. They shifted protein sources from forest birds to marine resources and, crucially, to chickens, which became their primary domesticated animal and protein source. The population may have declined from its peak, but it stabilized at a sustainable level. When Europeans arrived in 1722, they found not a collapsed civilization, but a functioning society, organized political structure, chiefs with authority, productive agriculture, people creating art, maintaining traditions, living lives, not thriving in the way they had with forests, but surviving, adapted, stable. The Rapa Nui didn't commit suicide by statue. They adapted, survived, and were still here when Europeans arrived. So why do we keep calling it a collapse? The evidence for catastrophic warfare seemed overwhelming. Archaeologists found thousands of sharp obsidian points shaped like elongated teardrops, perfect for mounting on spears. Caves showed signs of fortification, walls built across entrances, defensive positions overlooking approaches. Oral traditions collected by missionaries in the 19th century spoke of clan warfare, bitter conflicts over dwindling resources, desperate battles for survival. The moai themselves lay toppled from their platforms, faces down in the dirt, suggesting iconoclasm. Rival clans destroying each other, ancestral monuments in religious fury. And human remains showed evidence of violent death. Skulls fractured by blunt trauma, bones bearing cut marks. The story fit the collapse narrative perfectly. As resources dwindled after deforestation, society fractured into warring clans. Competition for diminishing supplies became violent. Tribes toppled rival moai to insult ancestors and break spiritual power. The island descended into chaos, population crashed, civilization collapsed into primitive subsistence. When Europeans arrived, they found the aftermath of catastrophe, but recent reanalysis has challenged almost every element of this interpretation. Start with the matter. Thousands have been found scattered across Easter Island, which seem to indicate a highly militarized society. But microscopic analysis of wear patterns tells a different story. Many matter, a show edge damage consistent with cutting and scraping, processing plant fibers, cutting fish, general tool use, not combat. While some were certainly weapons, the massive numbers found reflect their utility as all-purpose tools, not evidence of militarization. Finding lots of matter on Easter Island is like finding lots of Swiss Army knives in modern homes. It indicates usefulness, not warfare. The fortified caves proved less straightforward than assumed. Radiocarbon dating shows many so-called refuge caves were used primarily for agriculture and storage, not defense. The walls across entrances helped retain moisture for growing crops in protected environments, not keep out attackers. Some caves do show defensive features, suggesting occasional conflict, but the evidence indicates low-level raiding rather than endemic warfare. The toppled moai create dramatic images, hundreds of statues face down, apparently destroyed in violence. But engineering analysis reveals most fell forward from their platforms in patterns consistent with earthquakes or platform deterioration. Easter Island sits in a seismically active region. Over centuries, earthquakes would naturally topple statues. Some moai were certainly pushed over deliberately. You can tell from the patterns of breakage, but probably not in the massive iconoclasm previously imagined, not in frenzied destruction during societal collapse, and the skeletal evidence of violence. When you actually count the trauma, it is relatively rare. Yes, some individuals show signs of violent death, but the rates are consistent with low-level interpersonal violence found in most human societies. Arguments that turn physical, occasional raids, individual conflicts. Comparisons with other Polynesian islands show Easter Island's violence levels were actually unremarkable, even low by Pacific standards. So where did the collapse narrative come from? Much was influenced by early European visitors who arrived during a terrible period for the Rapa Nui. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders captured or killed much of the population. Over 1,500 people abducted to work in South American mines and plantations. Introduced diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis, devastated survivors. By the time missionaries arrived to collect oral histories, the Rapa Nui had experienced catastrophic population loss within living memory. The stories emphasized conflict, divine punishment, and doom because the storytellers had just lived through actual catastrophe. Europeans witnessed collapse, but it wasn't the ancient collapse. It was contemporary collapse caused by European contact. The crucial revelation, Rapa Nui civilization, probably didn't collapse before European arrival. Yes, they deforested the island. Yes, they driven bird species extinct. Yes, they caused environmental damage. Yes, their population had declined from perhaps 15,000 at peak to maybe 3,000 by the time Europeans arrived, but they adapted, they destabilized. They developed sustainable agricultural practices, shifted their protein sources, restructured at a lower level of complexity that the degraded environment could support. When Jacob Roggeveen visited in 1722, he found a functioning society, chiefs with authority, agricultural systems producing food, people healthy enough to come out to ships in canoes, to trade, to perform ceremonies. Not a paradise, but not a collapsed civilization either. An adapted one. The real collapse came later. European disease did what environmental stress hadn't, nearly erased the Rapa Nui entirely. By 1877, the population had crashed to just 111 people. That is genocide, not ecocide. That is collapse, but caused by outside contact, not internal failure. This reframing matters because Easter Island has been used for decades as the ultimate cautionary tale. Look what happens when societies exceed environmental limits. But if the Rapa Nui actually adapted successfully to environmental degradation and were only destroyed by external contact, then the lesson changes. The story becomes more complex, less moralistic, more honest. The environmental damage was real. The Rapa Nui paid a heavy price for colonizing an isolated island. Extinct species, lost forests, degraded soils. They pushed past ecological limits and suffered consequences. But they managed to restructure, to survive, to create a stable society at lower complexity. Easter Island didn't collapse from cutting down trees. It collapsed when Europeans arrived and did in decades what environmental stress could. Do in centuries, nearly erase the Rapa Nui entirely. If we misunderstood Easter Island this badly, what else have we gotten wrong about collapsed civilizations? In the late 13th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was dominated by empires that seemed eternal. The Hittites controlled Anatolia from their fortified capital at Hattusa, their kings corresponding as equals with Egyptian pharaohs. The Mycenaeans ruled Greece from palace complexes at Mycenae, Pylos and Tiryns, their merchant ships crossing the Aegean laden with goods. Egypt commanded the Nile and extended influence across the Levant. Sophisticated trading kingdoms like Ugarit prospered along the Syrian coast, their merchants linking civilizations from Mesopotamia to Crete. The palace at Knossos, though now under Mycenaean control, still commanded respect. Bronze flowed from Cyprus, mines feeding the weapons and tools that defined an age. This was a world system, interconnected, prosperous, stable. It had endured for centuries. Kings exchanged letters addressing each other as brothers. Trade routes spanned thousands of miles. Written languages recorded laws, transactions, and treaties. Civilization had reached a complexity the Mediterranean wouldn't see again for nearly 1,000 years. Then it burned. Within 50 years, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, almost all of it collapsed. Archaeological layers preserve the catastrophe. Destruction debris at dozens of sites across Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant palaces burned. Fortifications shattered, writing ceased. The material culture that had characterized late Bronze Age civilization, the distinctive pottery, the architectural styles, the trading networks, simply stopped. A dark age descended that would last 3 to 4 centuries, a period when literacy nearly vanished from Greece and populations crashed across the region. These weren't isolated disasters. This was cascade collapse, affecting an entire interconnected world, and our only clues about what caused it come from the survivors. Egyptian temple walls at Medinet Habu preserve dramatic reliefs showing Pharaoh Ramesses III battling invaders around 1177 BCE. The carved images depict ships with distinctive prows, warriors wearing horned helmets or feathered headdresses, families traveling in ox carts. Egyptian inscriptions name the attackers Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshish, and others. Groups modern scholars collectively call the Sea Peoples for lack of better terminology. Contemporary texts describe them coming from their islands, sweeping across the Mediterranean, leaving destruction. The inscriptions claim they came in great numbers, that no land could stand before them, that they destroyed kingdoms as they advanced. Ugarit, the prosperous Syrian trading city, was burned so thoroughly that the heat baked clay tablets, inadvertently preserving desperate final letters. One tablet reads, "The enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." But here is where the mystery becomes profound. We don't know who the Sea Peoples actually were. The Egyptian names don't clearly match any known ethnic groups. We can't identify their homeland with certainty. We don't know if they were a unified confederation or unrelated groups that Egyptian scribes lumped together. The descriptions are frustratingly vague. They came from the sea and from islands, which describes half the Mediterranean. They had unusual ships and wore different clothing, but those details don't tell us their origin or language or culture. Most puzzling, after appearing in records for a few decades, they vanish. They don't establish a clear empire. They don't leave writings in their own language. They don't create distinctive archaeological sites we can definitively identify. They appear, destroy, and disappear like a storm passing through. The scale of destruction they left is undeniable. Hattusa abandoned and burned. Mycenaean palaces destroyed across Greece. Ugarit annihilated so completely it was never rebuilt. Cyprus' copper production disrupted. Dozens of smaller settlements emptied, an entire world system shattered within 2 generations. In 50 years they destroyed empires that had stood for centuries. Then they vanished completely, leaving no names, no homeland, no trace, except the ruins they left behind. The question that has haunted archaeologists for over a century: how could mysterious raiders accomplish this? Were they really that formidable? Or were they simply the final blow to civilizations already dying? The civilizations that collapsed during the late Bronze Age crisis weren't primitive societies vulnerable to any determined attacker. They were sophisticated powers that had endured for centuries, commanding resources and military strength that should have made them nearly invincible. The Hittite Empire controlled central Anatolia and rivaled Egypt in power. Their capital at Hattusa featured massive cyclopean walls built from stones weighing several tons each, elaborate temple complexes, and archives containing thousands of cuneiform tablets. These tablets preserve diplomatic correspondence with other great powers, letters where Hittite kings address Egyptian pharaohs as equals, negotiate treaties, arrange marriages between royal families. This was a civilization with bureaucratic sophistication, military might, and international prestige. Around 1200 BCE, it simply ceased to exist. Hattusa was abandoned after a catastrophic fire. Provincial cities fell silent in the archaeological record. The empire that had commanded respect across the Near East for over 4 centuries disappeared within a single generation. The Hittites vanish from history so completely that when archaeologists rediscovered Hattusa in the early 20th century, it was a revelation. Scholars had forgotten such a major power had existed. Mycenaean Greece consisted of powerful palace states at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and elsewhere. These weren't simple fortresses, but administrative centers controlling sophisticated trade networks and producing remarkable art. The palaces stored linear B tablets, clay records baked and preserved by the fires that destroyed the buildings. These final administrative documents are haunting, inventories of bronze being collected, defensive preparations being undertaken, religious offerings suggesting crisis. The scribes recorded their world ending in real time. Then the palaces burned, writing ceased. Greece entered a dark age lasting 400 years, a period when literacy nearly vanished and populations crashed. But perhaps no site provides more poignant evidence than Ugarit, a cosmopolitan trading city on Syria's coast. Clay tablets preserved in the destruction layer include a desperate letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia in Cyprus. The enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in Hittite territory, and all my ships are in Luca territory? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. The letter captures the essence of the catastrophe. Military forces deployed elsewhere, the homeland left vulnerable, enemies arriving by sea, destruction complete. Ugarit was burned so thoroughly, it was never reoccupied. Its ruins remained buried for over 3,000 years. What was lost in these collapses? The sophistication of late Bronze Age civilization is only now being fully appreciated. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt, reveal a world of formal international relations with established protocols for communication between kingdoms. Trade networks brought tin from as far as Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic. Technological sophistication in metallurgy, shipbuilding, and fortification rivaled anything seen until classical Greece centuries later. This was a globalized world system. But here is the critical detail. These kingdoms were already stressed before the Sea Peoples arrived. Hittite letters from years before the collapse describe crop failures and desperate requests for emergency grain shipments from Egypt. Mycenaean palace records show increasing defensive preparations and evidence of resource hoarding, behavior suggesting perceived threats. Egyptian inscriptions describe repelling earlier invasions and dealing with famines. Climate proxies show severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Tree ring data indicates a series of dry years. Soil erosion evidence suggests agricultural intensification had degraded farmland. Some sites show earthquake damage from seismic sequences that struck the region. Contemporary texts mention crop failures, famines, and disrupted harvests. And crucially, the system was tightly interconnected in ways that created vulnerability. Bronze Age kingdoms depended on long-distance trade for essential resources, particularly tin and copper needed to produce bronze. When trade routes became unsafe due to raiders or political instability, bronze production faltered. Without bronze, military capability declined. Without military capability, territories became vulnerable to attack, a cascade. The palace economy system made this worse. Central authorities controlled production and distribution. Palaces collected taxes, stored grain, organized labor, coordinated defense. When palaces fell, entire economic and social systems collapsed with them. There was no decentralized fallback, no redundancy in the system. Most intriguingly, evidence suggests some groups identified as Sea Peoples in Egyptian texts were displaced populations from already collapsed regions. They weren't foreign invaders causing collapse, but refugees from collapse elsewhere, fleeing destroyed homelands and contributing to instability as they sought new territories. The distinction between raider and refugee blurs when entire populations are on the move. The late Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by sea raiders attacking healthy civilizations. It was systemic failure where climatic stress, economic disruption, military overextension, and political instability combined in cascading catastrophe. The Sea Peoples were perhaps both symptom and cause, displaced populations whose migrations added final stress to a system already fracturing. The empires didn't fall because sea raiders attacked. The sea raiders attacked because the empires were already falling. They were the symptoms of collapse, not the cause. After the palaces burned, Greece forgot how to write. For 400 years, 16 generations, no one recorded laws, transactions, or stories in written form. The Linear B script that palace scribes had used to track bronze inventories and chariot deployments simply vanished from human knowledge. When Greeks began writing again centuries later, they used a completely different system borrowed from Phoenician traders, an alphabet unrelated to the script their ancestors had used. The connection was lost. The knowledge was gone. This is what makes the late Bronze Age collapse so instructive. It wasn't just political upheaval or economic disruption. It was forgetting. Civilization didn't just fall, it actively shed complexity, simplified itself, became a lesser version of what it had been. Monumental architecture ceased. No one built palaces for centuries. Long-distance trade collapsed. The networks bringing tin from Afghanistan and amber from the Baltic simply stopped functioning. Populations declined dramatically across the region. Archaeological surveys show settlement patterns reverting to scattered villages from urban centers. Political organization simplified from powerful centralized kingdoms to small independent chiefdoms with limited authority. Even artistic sophistication regressed. Compare the elaborate frescoes from Mycenaean palaces, naturalistic scenes with multiple figures, sophisticated use of color, dynamic composition, to the pottery of the subsequent Dark Age, simple geometric patterns, stick figure decorations. Not stylistic choice, but loss of technique. The knowledge of how to create sophisticated art had been forgotten. This is what archaeologists call social simplification, the process by which complex societies, when stressed beyond their resilience point, don't just change but actively shed complexity. They become simpler versions of themselves, not temporarily during crisis, but for generations, sometimes centuries. Technologies are lost, organizational structures dissolve, knowledge vanishes. But some things survived. Basic metallurgy persisted. People still worked bronze and increasingly iron, though some specialized techniques were lost. Agricultural knowledge continued, perhaps better preserved in rural communities that weathered the collapse. Shipbuilding survived, allowing eventual resumption of trade. And oral tradition preserved stories that would eventually be recorded as Homer's epics, though how accurately they reflect Bronze Age reality remains debated. The pattern suggests that collapse wasn't universal but differential. Urban centers and palace economies, the complex interconnected parts of Bronze Age civilization, collapsed catastrophically. Rural communities, simpler and more self-sufficient, weathered the crisis better. Complexity was vulnerable, simplicity was resilient. This reveals something crucial about the Bronze Age system. It was efficient but brittle. Kingdoms depended on Mediterranean-wide trade for essential resources. Palace bureaucracies coordinated production and distribution across territories. Specialized craftspeople concentrated in urban centers created sophisticated goods. This organization generated wealth and power, but it eliminated redundancy. When trade routes became unsafe, there were no local alternatives for essential materials. When palaces fell, economic coordination collapsed entirely. When urban craftspeople fled or died, specialized knowledge disappeared. Like a house of cards, the system was impressive when stable but catastrophic when disturbed. Once key supports failed, everything collapsed together. No fallback mechanisms existed. The modern parallels are uncomfortable. Our civilization is similarly interconnected. Supply chains span continents. Financial systems integrate globally. Food production depends on international trade. Just-in-time manufacturing eliminates warehoused redundancy to maximize efficiency. We've built a world optimized for stability, which makes it fragile under stress. But the late Bronze Age collapse teaches another lesson about the Sea Peoples specifically. Unlike other collapsed civilizations discussed in this documentary, they weren't victims. They were possibly perpetrators, possibly symptoms, possibly both. Yet they vanished just as thoroughly as their supposed victims. Some scholars believe certain Sea Peoples groups settled in the Levant, the Peliset perhaps becoming the Philistines of later biblical accounts. But their origins, their organization, their ultimate fate all remain unknown. Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Instead of who were the Sea Peoples, we should ask what conditions create migration crises that destroy civilizations. The answer: systemic stress from climate change and crop failures. Interconnected vulnerability where kingdoms depend on trade they can't protect. Political fragmentation that prevents coordinated response. Technological parity where attackers and defenders have similar military capabilities. In such conditions, relatively small groups of displaced peoples can trigger cascading failures in weakened systems. They don't need to be numerous or militarily superior. They just need to arrive at precisely the wrong moment. The Sea Peoples destroyed empires not because they were powerful, but because they arrived at the exact moment when the world was ready to break. They were the final push on a civilization already falling. The Bronze Age didn't collapse because mysterious raiders attacked. It collapsed because it had built itself into a configuration that made collapse inevitable once multiple stresses aligned. And then civilization forgot how to be complex for 4 centuries. As if the survivors collectively decided that simplicity was safer than the sophisticated fragility that had betrayed them. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating what local farmers thought was a medieval burial ground on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. Within days, he realized he'd found something that shouldn't exist. Massive T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circles, some standing 16 feet tall, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals. The craftsmanship was sophisticated, the scale ambitious, the organization required impressive. Then came the dating results: 9,600 BCE, 11,600 years old. Built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, and most impossibly before the invention of agriculture. This shouldn't be possible. Every textbook on human civilization teaches the same sequence. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, then about 10,000 years ago invented agriculture, which led to settled communities, which generated food surplus, which allowed specialization, which created social hierarchies, which eventually enabled complex projects like monumental architecture. Civilization creates monuments. That is the fundamental progression. Göbekli Tepe inverts the entire sequence. The monuments came first. The site features at least 20 circular enclosures discovered so far, and ground-penetrating radar suggests more remain buried. Some pillars weigh 10 to 20 tons, quarried, carved, transported, and erected by people who supposedly lacked the organization for such projects. The artistic skill is remarkable. Lions, bears, leopards, vultures, snakes, foxes, wild cattle, scorpions, all rendered in sophisticated relief. Abstract symbols appear whose meaning we can only guess. Without writing, the builders left no explanation. We don't know what these images meant, what ceremonies occurred here, what beliefs drove people to create this place. Creating Göbekli Tepe required coordinated labor from hundreds, perhaps thousands of people over decades. Someone organized the workforce, someone planned the construction, someone decided which animals to carve and where to place them. This suggests social complexity that wasn't supposed to exist among pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers who we assumed lived in small, egalitarian bands without centralized authority or the ability to mobilize large-scale collective labor. But here is what makes Göbekli Tepe even stranger. There is no evidence anyone lived here, no houses, no trash middens suggesting permanent occupation, no water sources nearby, crucial for settlement. People came to this hilltop, built monuments, participated in ceremonies, then left. Analysis of animal bones scattered across the site shows massive consumption of wild game, particularly gazelle. Thousands of animals were slaughtered and eaten here, suggesting huge communal gatherings, feasts on a scale that seems incompatible with mobile hunter-gatherer groups. They built humanity's first monumental architecture not after inventing farming, but before. Then, after more than 1,500 years of use, they deliberately buried it and walked away. Around 8,000 BCE, the enclosures were carefully filled with debris and rubble. This wasn't abandonment, this was entombment. The pillars were covered, the chambers sealed, the entire complex buried under tons of material. This required enormous labor, possibly as much as the original construction. Why invest such effort in hiding what you'd spent generations building? Then Göbekli Tepe was forgotten. For 10,000 years it remained buried under that artificial hill, unknown, its existence unsuspected. Until Klaus Schmidt excavation revealed what had been hidden, evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about civilization's origins. What were they worshipping? And why did they want it forgotten? The stones won. Answer. They just stand there, carved with images of predators and symbols we can decode, keeping secrets from before history began. The story you learned in school goes like this. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, small mobile bands following game animals and seasonal plants. Then, around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, they invented agriculture. They began cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats. Agriculture produced food surplus. Surplus allowed permanent settlements. Settlements enabled specialization. Some people could farm while others made pottery, worked metal, or built structures. Specialization created social hierarchies. Hierarchies eventually generated cities, writing, organized religion, and monumental architecture. The sequence seems logical. Agriculture enables civilization. Civilization creates monuments. First you need to feed people reliably, then you can afford to build temples. Göbekli Tepe reverses the entire sequence. The monuments came first. This forces a radical reinterpretation. If monuments preceded agriculture, perhaps the causation ran backward. Perhaps religion drove agriculture, not the other way around. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe, proposed exactly this. Building and maintaining the site required large groups to gather regularly. Feeding these gatherings stressed local wild resources. Only so many gazelles and wild plants could be harvested sustainably. The pressure to feed periodic large gatherings incentivized people to begin cultivating plants and domesticating animals. The need to maintain ritual sites forced the invention of farming. Evidence supports this theory. The region around Göbekli Tepe is precisely where wheat was first domesticated. Early agricultural sites cluster near similar stone monuments, though none as elaborate as Göbekli Tepe. The timeline works. Agriculture appears in southeastern Anatolia shortly after monumental construction begins. Religion came first. Farming followed to support religious practice. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Hunter-gatherers typically worked fewer hours and enjoyed better health than early farmers. Archaeological evidence shows that adoption of agriculture initially led to worse nutrition, shorter stature, more disease, harder labor. Why would people voluntarily choose a lifestyle that made them worse off? The traditional answer was population growth. Farming supports more people per square mile, so growing populations forced agricultural adoption. But perhaps the causation was reversed. Perhaps social and religious imperatives drove people to gather in larger groups, which then necessitated agriculture to feed those groups. We didn't farm because we needed more food. We needed more food because we chose to gather for reasons that had nothing to do with calories. The feast theory explores this. Göbekli Tepe's archaeological layers contain massive quantities of animal bones, particularly gazelle. Thousands of animals were slaughtered and consumed here. These weren't everyday meals. These were feasts, huge communal gatherings involving hundreds of people. Perhaps competition for status drove individuals to host larger feasts, creating pressure to secure more food, eventually forcing agricultural innovation. And there is evidence of beer. Early brewing installations have been found near Göbekli Tepe. Chemical analysis of residues suggests fermented beverages. Perhaps the desire for alcohol for ritual consumption drove grain cultivation. Did we invent farming to throw better parties, to brew more beer for religious ceremonies? The question sounds absurd until you consider how much human behavior is driven by social competition and ritual practice. But there is a darker possibility. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe doesn't represent the inevitable origin of civilization, but an early experiment that was abandoned because people realized where it led. The deliberate burial around 8000 BCE suggests something went wrong. For 1500 years, people maintained this site, gathered here, created increasingly elaborate enclosures. Then they carefully entombed everything and walked away. Archaeological evidence from later Neolithic sites in the region shows people building smaller, less impressive structures, as if intentionally simplifying. They knew how to build monuments like Göbekli Tepe. They chose not to. Perhaps they realized the costs. Maintaining Göbekli Tepe required organized labor, which required social hierarchy, which required inequality. Feeding large gatherings required intensifying food production, which required harder work. The path toward monuments and agriculture led toward complexity, stratification, the loss of egalitarian hunter-gatherer life. Maybe they looked ahead, saw where this led, and chose to stop. Göbekli Tepe might represent a road not taken. Humanity experimented with complexity, then deliberately abandoned the experiment when the costs became clear. This reframes everything. Civilizations don't just collapse from external stress. Sometimes people choose to walk away from complexity because simplicity offers something civilization can freedom from the demands of maintaining monuments, hierarchies, and agricultural systems. What if Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of civilization, but the beginning of humanity choosing to walk away from it? What if we abandoned complexity before and might again? Around 8000 BCE, after 1500 years of use, the people who had built and maintained Göbekli Tepe made a decision. They would close it, not abandon it, close it properly, permanently. The archaeological evidence is clear. The enclosures weren't destroyed in violence or slowly abandoned through neglect. They were systematically filled with debris, rubble, and artifacts in a process that took years, possibly decades, and required enormous labor. Some pillars were carefully laid down before burial, others were left standing but deliberately entombed. The fill contains tools, animal bones, even pottery shards from later periods, suggesting people continued visiting even as they buried the site, leaving offerings as they sealed away what their ancestors had built. This wasn't destruction. This was ritual decommissioning, almost like a funeral for a sacred place. But why bury something you spent generations creating? Several theories attempt to explain this mystery. The ecological theory suggests that the massive feasting gatherings depleted local resources. Thousands of gazelles slaughtered over centuries would stress wild populations. Perhaps hunting pressure made the site unsustainable. But if resources were exhausted, why not simply abandon the site? Why invest the enormous labor required to bury it deliberately? The social revolution theory proposes that people rejected the hierarchical authority that Göbekli Tepe represented. Building and maintaining such monuments requires organization, which implies hierarchy. Perhaps people rebelled against emerging social stratification, burying the site as symbolic rejection of inequality. Evidence suggests that early agricultural societies were initially more egalitarian than later periods, hinting at possible cycles where centralization prompted resistance and temporary return to equality. The religious transformation theory draws on cross-cultural examples. When belief systems change, old sacred sites sometimes must be ritually destroyed or buried. The new gods require elimination of the old. Perhaps whatever religion created Göbekli Tepe was replaced by new beliefs that demanded burial of the old temples, closing one spiritual chapter to open another. But there is a fourth possibility: voluntary simplification. Perhaps the people recognized that maintaining Göbekli Tepe was leading them down a path they didn't want to travel. The site required regular gatherings. Gatherings required food. Securing food for large groups was pushing them toward agriculture and permanent settlement. Maybe they saw where this led: toward hierarchy, toward property, toward the loss of mobile hunter-gatherer freedom, and chose to stop. They buried the site to end the experiment before it transformed them irreversibly. And there is one more theory, speculative but intriguing. Look closely at what is carved on those pillars: lions, leopards, bears, snakes, vultures, scorpions, dangerous creatures, predators. Traditional interpretations assume these represent power totems or cosmological symbols. But what if they represent something else? Warnings, reminders of the chaos that lurks beyond human control, the dangers of the wild that threaten communities. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was about confronting fear through ritual, about managing the psychological terror of living in a world full of predators, and perhaps burying it represented a fundamental shift from fearing the wild and appeasing it through ceremony to controlling the wild through agriculture and settlement. From ritual management of nature to practical domination of it, the timing supports this. Göbekli Tepe's burial coincides with the rapid spread of agriculture throughout the Fertile Crescent. Perhaps these events are connected. Perhaps burying the temple of the wild gods marked the decision to become farmers, to transform from people who negotiated with nature through ritual into people who controlled nature through cultivation. If so, it was a choice with profound consequences. Agriculture led to property ownership, which led to inequality. Settlement led to disease. Surplus led to population growth. Complexity led to hierarchy. The path from Göbekli Tepe's burial leads directly to everything explored in earlier chapters: the cities, the empires, the collapses. Perhaps the builders understood this. Perhaps they tried to stop it by burying their monuments, by ending the ritual gatherings that were pulling them toward complexity. But the choice had already been made. The momentum toward agriculture proved unstoppable. Göbekli Tepe was buried, but the future it represented, or warned against, came anyway. Here is the bitter irony. Less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Most remains buried under the artificial hill created by its builders 10,000 years ago. What other secrets lie beneath? What explanations might we discover for why humanity's first monument was also its first abandonment? We may never know. The exposed portions are deteriorating from weather exposure. There is serious debate about halting excavation to preserve what remains buried. We may have to bury Göbekli Tepe again, this time to save it from time's ravages, reenacting the ancient decision, though for different reasons. They buried the world's first temple deliberately, methodically, almost lovingly. Perhaps they knew something we're only beginning to understand, that the path towards civilization is also the path toward collapse. Look across the ruins of 9 civilizations spanning 10,000 years from Göbekli Tepe to Angkor, from the Indus Valley to Easter Island, and patterns emerge. Not coincidences, patterns. 7 warning signs that appear regardless of time period, regardless of geography, regardless of whether societies knew about each other's existence. The first sign, unsustainable complexity. Every civilization we've examined became more complex over time. The Khmer built water systems of increasing sophistication, turning simple canals into networks spanning hundreds of miles. The Bronze Age kingdoms developed trade routes stretching from Afghanistan to the Baltic. The Indus Valley created urban infrastructure requiring constant coordination across millions of people. Complexity generated benefits, more food, more wealth, more security. But it also created fragility. Systems optimized for stability couldn't handle change. When conditions shifted, complexity transformed from strength to liability. The Angkor water system sustained 1 million people until monsoon patterns changed, then caused catastrophic failure. The Bronze Age trade networks enabled prosperity until disruption turned interdependence into vulnerability. The second sign, environmental stress. No civilization collapsed purely from environmental causes, but each faced ecological challenges. The Indus Valley's rivers changed course. The ancestral Puebloans endured megadrought. Easter Island lost its forests. The Bronze Age Mediterranean suffered prolonged drought. Environmental stress doesn't destroy civilizations directly. It reveals which social systems are resilient and which are brittle. It exposes the difference between societies that can adapt and those that can't. The third sign, social stratification. As civilizations grew, inequality increased. Archaeological evidence shows the pattern repeating. Early egalitarianism giving way to class hierarchies, elite burials becoming elaborate while common graves simplify, luxury goods concentrating in fewer hands. At Chaco Canyon, elites consumed exotic trade goods while common people showed signs of nutritional stress. When elites capture most benefits while commoners bear most costs, the social contract fractures, cooperation erodes. People stop believing the system serves them. The fourth sign, declining innovation. In their final centuries, civilizations often stagnate creatively and technologically. They repeat earlier artistic styles rather than innovating. Minoan art in the final decades becomes formulaic. Indus Valley craftsmanship declines. Easter Island's later moai show less sophistication than earlier ones. This suggests societies losing dynamism, becoming maintenance cultures focused on preserving what exists rather than creating something new. When innovation stops, it signals that a civilization has turned inward, defensive, exhausted. The fifth sign, infrastructural decay. Across multiple cases, infrastructure maintenance declined before collapse. Angkor's canals silted without proper dredging. Indus Valley streets developed unrepaired potholes. Mycenaean palace walls were hastily rebuilt with cruder materials. When societies stop maintaining infrastructure, it signals resource stress or organizational breakdown. The systems that made urban life possible begin failing, creating cascading consequences. The sixth sign, increased violence or isolation. Collapsing societies respond to stress in 2 ways: they fight or they withdraw. The ancestral Puebloans show evidence of increased conflict in their final decades. Bronze Age kingdoms fortified previously open settlements. But others chose isolation. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, removing it from use. Easter Island's remote location became more isolation than protection. Both responses indicate social trust breaking down, whether through competition for resources or withdrawal from cooperation that no longer benefits participants. The seventh sign, symbolic abandonment. This is perhaps the most mysterious pattern. Multiple civilizations show evidence of deliberately decommissioning monuments before physical collapse. Göbekli Tepe was carefully buried. Olmec heads were systematically mutilated. Ancestral Puebloans sealed their homes from the outside. Angkor's core temples were maintained even as the city emptied around them. Before buildings fall, belief falls. People stop investing in the symbols that represent their civilization. They perform closing rituals. They walk away from what their ancestors built. Not every civilization shows all 7 signs, but most show several, and the combination appears too consistent to be coincidence. These patterns suggest deep truths about how complex societies function and fail. 7 signs appear across every vanished civilization, from the oldest temple to the most recent empire. When you see them together, collapse isn't a mystery, it is almost inevitable. Here is the paradox that every collapsed civilization reveals. The very developments that made them successful contained the seeds of their failure. The solutions that saved them eventually destroyed them. Progress became trap. Consider the Khmer hydraulic system. It was a triumph of engineering that made Angkor possible, sustaining 1 million people in an environment that should have supported far fewer. The network of reservoirs, canals, and distribution systems turned monsoon chaos into agricultural abundance. 3 rice harvests per year, unprecedented prosperity. But this triumph created dependency. The population grew beyond what natural water sources could support. When the system failed during climate shifts, people couldn't simply return to pre-urban life. There were too many of them. The land couldn't feed them without the engineering. Progress had locked them into a configuration that became catastrophic when conditions changed. The Bronze Age trade networks tell the same story. Kingdoms accessed tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic. Specialization increased efficiency. Culture and technology spread. Prosperity reached heights that wouldn't be matched for centuries. But interconnection meant vulnerability. When trade routes became unsafe, kingdoms far from the actual conflict suffered. A disruption in one region cascaded across the entire system. The Hittites depended on imported grain during famines. When grain shipments stopped, the empire starved. Globalization created wealth, but it also created fragility. The Indus Valley's urban sophistication improved quality of life in ways that seem almost modern. Covered sewage systems, private bathrooms, public wells, grid planning, cultural amenities. Urban life offered benefits rural existence couldn't match. But sustaining cities required constant resource influx from countryside, complex administration, and social cohesion. When people lost faith in urban benefits, they could walk away. But they couldn't recreate urban sophistication in scattered villages. The knowledge of how to build sewage systems didn't help if there were no cities to build them in. Civilization's benefits proved impossible to maintain at smaller scales. This is what researchers call the progress trap. Solutions to problems create new, often worse problems. Agriculture solved food scarcity, but created property ownership, which created inequality, which created warfare. Writing solved information storage, but required bureaucracies to manage records, which constrained individual freedom. Cities solved security and economic efficiency, but concentrated populations, which spread disease, created pollution, generated social anonymity that eroded community bonds. Each innovation solved immediate problems while creating long-term vulnerabilities. Anthropologist Joseph Tainter described it as diminishing returns on complexity. Societies solve challenges by adding complexity, more administration, more infrastructure, more specialization. Initially, the returns are enormous. A little organization yields huge benefits. Basic irrigation increases crop yields dramatically. Simple trade networks provide access to previously unavailable resources. But eventually, returns diminish. You need administrators to manage administrators, infrastructure to maintain infrastructure. The complexity required to manage existing complexity grows faster than the benefits it generates. Society reaches a point where additional complexity costs more than it delivers, but reducing complexity means abandoning the systems that made success possible. The sophistication that enabled survival becomes the constraint preventing adaptation. Angkor's water system sustained them until it trapped them. The Bronze Age trade networks enriched them until disruption bankrupted them. The Indus Valley's urban planning elevated them until maintaining it exhausted them. And we see the pattern in our own civilization. Our infrastructure requires infrastructure to maintain. Our global economy's efficiency creates vulnerability to disruption. Our technological sophistication advances faster than our wisdom to manage consequences. The parallels aren't subtle. But here is the question that haunts every study of collapse. Why can't civilizations learn from these patterns? Why do societies keep building complexity until it breaks them? Because the incentives driving complexity are powerful and immediate. The Khmer engineers who expanded Angkor's water system weren't foolish. They responded rationally to population pressure and resource needs. But local optimization, solving today's problem with available tools, led to global vulnerability. Political leaders face pressure to solve problems, now not to avoid hypothetical future consequences. Immediate benefits always feel more real than distant costs. Individual advantage always seems more tangible than collective risk. The paradox can't be solved through knowledge alone. Knowing that complexity creates vulnerability doesn't prevent societies from pursuing complexity, because complexity also creates prosperity, security, and survival. The choice isn't between safety and risk, it is between different kinds of risk. The risk of not adapting versus the risk of adapting too well. Perhaps collapse isn't failure but transformation. Perhaps civilizations aren't meant to last forever, but to evolve, simplify, reorganize at different scales. The people who walked away from Indus Valley cities, who left cliff dwellings, who buried Göbekli Tepe. Maybe they understood something we resist, that sometimes walking away from complexity is wisdom, not defeat. Everything that makes civilization succeed eventually makes it fail. We build solutions that become prisons, create progress that becomes trap. The paradox isn't whether collapse comes, it is whether we'll be wise enough to simplify before complexity destroys us. Stand in the ruins at dawn one more time. Feel the wind through empty corridors. The stones still remember what we've forgotten. But now, after journeying through 9 vanished civilizations across 10,000 years, the question takes on different weight. Are we next? The honest answer requires acknowledging both concern and hope, neither doom-saying nor naive optimism, but clear-eyed assessment of where we stand. The concerning parallels are undeniable. Modern civilization shows several classic warning signs. Our complexity has increased exponentially. Supply chains spanning continents, financial systems interconnecting globally, infrastructure dependencies multiplying. We face environmental stress on scales previous civilizations never imagined. Climate change, resource depletion, ecosystem degradation happening simultaneously across the planet. Inequality rises in many societies, concentrating wealth and power while straining social contracts. Our infrastructure shows maintenance deficits, bridges crumbling, water systems aging. Innovation in solving fundamental problems, sustainable energy, social cohesion, ecological balance, seems to lag behind our multiplication of derivative complexity. And unlike ancient civilizations, we understand these patterns. We can see the warning signs. But knowledge doesn't guarantee action. The Angkor engineers understood their water system was failing. They responded by building more elaborate solutions that made things worse. The Mycenaeans saw threats coming and prepared defenses that proved inadequate. Knowledge and wisdom aren't the same thing. Seeing danger doesn't mean we'll avoid it. But there are reasons for cautious optimism that distinguish us from every civilization that came before. We can study collapse. We have historical awareness ancient peoples lacked. The Indus Valley people facing decline had no precedent to reference, no examples of how complexity fails, no warnings from previous civilizations. We have thousands of years of experiments to learn from. Every case examined in this documentary teaches lessons about what creates vulnerability and what enables resilience. Our technology gives us capabilities unimaginable to ancient peoples. We can communicate globally instantly, mobilize resources rapidly, innovate at unprecedented speed. Our understanding of ecology, climate, and complex systems lets us model consequences before they occur. We can see problems earlier and potentially address them more effectively. The question is whether we'll use this knowledge and these capabilities wisely. But here is the crucial insight that reframes everything. Collapse isn't binary. It is not civilization versus chaos, existence versus extinction. When we examined supposedly collapsed civilizations closely, we found that people often survived, adapted, reorganized at different scales of complexity. The Indus Valley people dispersed but didn't disappear. Their descendants still live in the region, carrying forward genetic and cultural continuity. The Ancestral Puebloans left their cliff dwellings but thrived, their descendants maintaining cultural identity for 7 centuries since. Easter Island's population stabilized at sustainable levels, adapted to degraded environment, survived until European contact did what environmental stress couldn't. Even after the Bronze Age collapse, people rebuilt. The Greeks who rose from Mycenaean ashes created classical civilization that influences us still. Collapse is transformation, not ending. Perhaps civilizations aren't meant to last forever, but to evolve complete cycles, give way to new forms. The real question isn't whether civilization will collapse, but whether we can simplify deliberately before we're forced to. Can we reduce complexity voluntarily, trading efficiency for resilience, convenience for sustainability? Can we accept that not all growth is progress, that sometimes smaller is more durable, that ancient peoples who walked away from cities might have been wise rather than defeated? The civilizations explored in this documentary didn't fail. They completed cycles. They rose, flourished, transformed, gave way to new forms. Their monuments remain, their descendants survive, their stories teach. Perhaps collapse isn't the opposite of success, but a stage in the longer process of human cultural evolution. So return to the opening question one final time. What force could erase entire civilizations from existence? The answer after this journey: no single force, but patterns. Patterns of complexity breeding fragility, success creating dependency, solutions becoming traps, people eventually walking away from systems that no longer serve them, but also patterns of survival, adaptation, renewal. We stand at our own crossroads with more knowledge than any previous civilization, but facing challenges they never imagined. The ruins are both warning and comfort. Warning that complexity can fail, comfort that people survive and begin again. They left us their ruins, their mysteries, their warnings. Now we face our own moment. Will we be remembered as the civilization wise enough to simplify before collapse forced us to, or as just another silence in stone?